He was born as a gentle giant among the stables and kitchens of Winterfell, known to most only by the single curious word he seemed able to speak. Hodor. He would say over and over, as though that were enough to summarize his entirety, an echo of a deeper truth no one truly understood. Yet the name stuck, becoming his identity, his brand, and in its simple monotony, it seemed to reflect an unassuming nature, obedient, kind, harmless. He was an immense figure with broad shoulders and kind eyes, a simpleton many called him, though there was a sadness to that label. If only they had known that beneath his massive frame and that childlike expression lurked a secret tethered to a destiny no one in the north could have foreseen. Hodor, who could do little more than care for young lords, carry their burdens, and speak his single word, was more than he seemed. He was a door, a barrier, and possibly a crucial link in the war between the living and the dead. In the cold dawns, he hauled water from the wells, the pale winter sun glinting in his white hair. He stacked feed for the stable boys, who teased him sometimes, though never cruelly. When the little lords or ladies walked past him, they giggled at his constant refrain, "Hodor!" and they would mimic him, receiving from him only a broad, good-natured smile. Often, they would ride upon his shoulders through the courtyards, as if he were a docile beast of burden. No one suspected there was anything more, for he wore his simplicity like armor. Yet in the quiet corners of Winterfell, the old knights remembered old stories, and some, though they did not speak of it openly, saw something strange about his eyes, as if in their dull depths, an entire cosmos of potential and tragedy might exist. He spent most of his life in service to House Stark, a house known for its loyalty and sense of honor, a family whose lineage was intertwined with ancient magic and secrets older than the Wall. Their very motto, "Winter is coming," was more than a warning of changing seasons. It was a call to vigilance against the deep, unimaginable dark. And the Stark children, with their wolves and their dire dreams, were not the only ones touched by fate. Hodor, too, had been brushed by powers beyond mortal ken. And so he was drawn to the youngest of the Stark boys, gentle Bran, who would one day become the three-eyed raven. Through Bran's powers, Hodor would learn that his existence was not merely incidental. He was at once an instrument of life's fragile hope and, just as dangerously, a potential pawn for the gloom that rose in the far north. The winter winds carried word that the dead marched south, led by inhuman creatures known in the stories as the Others, White Walkers, the old wives' tales whispered. All the north trembled at the thought. People barricaded themselves behind walls or sought safety in numbers, as if that could protect them from an ancient force that feared neither blade nor fortress. Rumors came trickling down that these White Walkers had powers of ice and death, that they could reanimate the fallen, turning them into whites. And though Hodor could not speak of it, though he could only look with wide eyes at the ghostly horizon, somewhere deep within that gentle giant's mind was a memory older than he was, a whisper that maybe, in some twisted design, he was meant to do more than hold a door against darkness. Perhaps, in some horrifying prophecy, his strength might be twisted into a tool of that same dark. Because the White Walkers, when they looked upon mortal men, saw pieces in a game, and they would stop at nothing to harness every potential advantage. Days in Winterfell passed slower than usual with the arrival of the bitter cold. The nights grew long, their blackness deeper, stars sharper in their glimmer. The main courtyard was no longer bustling with hopeful noise, but quiet with that careful hush that sets in before a storm. Hodor still carried feed bags, still accompanied Bran, and still repeated his name. That never changed. Yet a tension in the air was palpable even to him. He could feel it in the way the other servants talked in hushed voices, in the way the lords and ladies gathered in urgent council. There was a shift in the realm's aura, and though his simple mind couldn't quite parse the meaning, he felt something ominous creeping on the edges of his awareness. If you looked closely, you might see a flicker of fear in his eyes. But no one truly did, for he was to them always Hodor. Then Bran Stark began his journey to the far north, searching for the being who could teach him about his strange powers. As Bran walked, Hodor walked. As Bran struggled, Hodor lifted him, carried him, protected him like a faithful mastiff. It was on that journey that the giant stable boy would discover fragments of the truth in the same measure that Bran discovered his own. Over ice-choked rivers, through haunted forests where every leafless tree seemed to watch, the group trudged onward. Hodor often led the way, plodding tirelessly through deep snow, lifting Bran high on his shoulders, an anchor of physical strength and unwavering loyalty. Yet even in that harsh environment, fleeting nightmares trailed them, ominous silhouettes glimpsed at the edge of vision, the howls of undead beasts, a sense of being stalked by something older and crueler than any mortal predator. The White Walkers were real, and their armies of the dead expanded with each life lost in the cold. Sometimes in the night, Bran's eyes would glaze over as he warged into his wolf or into Hodor himself, this gentle giant and unintended vessel. Hodor would wake from these experiences trembling, sweat coating his brow despite the freezing temperatures. Though he did not understand the reasons each time it happened, the barrier in his mind thinned a little more. Memories he should not possess bubbled up in confused fragments. Shouts echoing in stone corridors, the clang of steel, a door that must be held against an onrushing tide of undead hands. He would sit upright in the snow, chest heaving, breath visible, tears in his eyes. If he had words he would have questioned Bran or perhaps demanded an explanation, but all he could do was gasp his one word. Hodor. Then the sorrow of it would swallow him and he'd drift back into the blankness of oblivion. On one such evening when the campfire was dying down and Mira Reed stood watch, Bran whispered to his companion and sister in arms that he feared for Hodor. There's something happening inside him, Bran said. Every time I warg into him, it's like I see echoes of something. A time I don't remember, or maybe a future or a past. I'm afraid I'm hurting him. Mira, her spear in hand, looked across at the sleeping giant propped against a tree trunk, arms folded, snoring softly. She exhaled a plume of white breath. We need him though, she whispered back. We can't move quickly or safely without him. He's our shield, our carrier, our constant. Bran nodded gravely, guilt etched on his youthful face. But he isn't a tool. He's a person, Bran replied quietly but firmly. And something is telling me there is a darkness that hunts him. Mira didn't answer because she too had sensed, in that eerie hush of northern nights, that there was more to Hodor than a simpleton's heart. She had seen the White Walkers once, distant shapes in a clearing of that endless forest, their eyes shimmering blue in the darkness. She had felt in that moment that they were not merely looking for living souls to slay but searching for someone. Was it the same sense of purpose that Bran felt? Could they want Hodor for some dark design, some key or tool or living weapon? She tried to dismiss it as a fancy or a byproduct of her own fear, but the thought lingered. That journey took them eventually to the cave of the three-eyed raven, hidden in the root-tangled depths below an ancient weirwood. There, with the guidance of an immortal figure who had once been a man, Bran and Hodor learned shocking truths. Through mystic visions, Bran glimpsed the possibilities of past and future. He saw the creation of the White Walkers by the children of the forest. He witnessed countless battles, betrayals, births, and deaths, all swirling in an endless tapestry of time. In the corner of those swirling visions, he saw Hodor's face, contorted in terror, saw his lips forming the word Hodor again and again, as though it were a shield against madness. And behind Hodor, ominous as a thundercloud on the horizon, stood a tall shape with skin like ice and eyes lit with a baleful glow. Bran couldn't fully interpret the vision, but the message chilled him. The White Walkers had marked him, yes, but they were interested in Hodor as well, and they would not rest until they found a way to harness that secret he carried within. Still, day after day passed in the dark safety of that cave, where the walls were threaded with roots as thick as a man's arm, and an ageless hush blanketed everything. Hodor sat quietly by the fire, playing with the bones of small animals that had perished in the cold. He arranged them in patterns as though guided by some half-forgotten memory. He would tilt his head, a vague sense of wonder in his eyes, and softly say, Hodor. Outside, a blizzard raged, the wind keening, an almost human wail. Bran was deep in training, learning from the three-eyed raven how to move within his visions carefully, how to avoid the attention of the Night King. But the mind is a treacherous realm, and one night Bran delved too far, too rashly. In a dream walk, Bran found himself in an ancient grove of weirwoods from centuries past. The trees had faces carved in their bark, and blood-red sap tears trailed down their twisted trunks. Snow fell like shards of broken stars. The air was so still, it felt as though the entire world held its breath. Then, without warning, a figure emerged from behind a trunk. A White Walker, tall, gaunt, its movements smooth as a serpent. Its face was sharp and alien, eyes burning an otherworldly blue. In its hand, it held a wicked blade of ice. Bran knew he was in a vision, that he could not truly be harmed, or so he had been taught. But there was a stifling presence about this walker, and as it raised a hand, Bran felt an iron clamp over his mind. He tried to call out, to run, to do anything, but he was frozen in that dream as the walker approached. A voice like the sigh of wind whispered in his consciousness. A voice that was not a voice said, "He is ours." Bran awoke screaming, drenched in sweat. The three-eyed raven was there, old and pale, his voice low as the grave, warning Bran never to roam so carelessly in the realm of dreams. "They have seen you," the old man said, "and now they know. They will come for you, and they will come for Hodor." The three words rang in the icy chamber like a hammer blow. Come for Hodor. For if the White Walkers could break the gentle giant's spirit, if they could subvert that raw strength and whatever hidden magic that lingered in him, they might wield him as a powerful weapon, a vessel for their own dark presence, or a puppet to break any stronghold. The concept chilled Bran more than any winter storm could. He remembered his friend's kindness, how Hodor had carried him through countless miles of tundra, protected him as best he could from any threat. To see that innocence broken and twisted was unthinkable. Yet the night was full of unthinkable horrors. It was only a short time later that doom finally came. The White Walkers arrived en masse, as if conjured from the swirling snow. Their undead army poured into the cave like an unholy tide. The children of the forest fought valiantly. Mira Reed launched spear after spear. Bran tried to warg into anything he could to fend them off. Hodor stood near the main opening, trembling. He had never looked so frightened, not even in his worst nightmares. The inhuman screeches of wights filled the air, bone-chilling. At the threshold of the cave, the Night King appeared, robes of dark ice trailing, the crown of horns on his head glinting in the pale light. He raised an arm, and the undead parted before him. He looked directly at Bran, then at Hodor, and a moment of cruel recognition lit those frost-blue eyes. It was as though he saw inside the giant, glimpsed a potential that not even Hodor himself understood. Then chaos erupted. Hodor, tears streaming, pushed forward, following Mira's urgent commands. He hauled Bran onto a sledge, pulling him through the narrow tunnel that ran behind the cave. The echoes of battle filled every twist and turn, horrifying moans and the clash of ice on stone. The children of the forest detonated magical explosives of fire and energy, the flickering lights briefly illuminating the grotesque shapes of the wights. A sacrificial last stand was staged by them to allow Bran and Hodor to flee. They stumbled through twisting roots, searching desperately for another exit. The walls around them trembled as if the entire earth wept. The Night King's power was unstoppable, and the cave would not hold for long. Then came that fateful moment. They reached a wooden door at the end of the tunnel that led to the outside. Beyond it, the wind howled and white snow blurred the world. Mira flung the door open, urging Bran's sledge through, while Hodor stood inside, bracing his back against it to keep the undead from pouring through. "Hold the door!" Mira screamed, and the words reverberated in Bran's mind. Time twisted in that instant, merging past and present in the strange alchemy of Bran's powers. Hodor slammed his weight into the door as the wights battered it from the other side. "Hold the door," Mira cried again. And that day, Hodor became both the shield and the sacrifice, pushing with all his might against a horde that scratched and clawed to claim them. The door splintered under unholy strength, and Hodor's eyes rolled back. He was lost in a swirl of memory and terror. He repeated, "Hodor, Hodor, Hodor," each word an echo of Mira's desperate plea, "Hold the door." Something primal snapped in him, forging that single word from the chaos of his mind. Yet even as he did so, the White Walkers recognized the resonance of that magic, that moment. Through the sundered timelines, the Night King's attention locked onto Hodor with renewed purpose. There was more to the giant than just his body or his loyalty. There was a fracture in him, an opening in the magic that branched through time, and such a rift could be exploited. They escaped that night, though Hodor was gravely scarred by what happened. Indeed, that moment was supposed to be his end, but somehow, by a near miracle, Mira and Bran dragged him away from the onrushing undead once the door gave way. He collapsed in the snow, blood streaming from his arms, chest heaving. Mira, panting, pulled him to his feet, and they staggered away under the flickering light of dawn. Bran, barely conscious, clung to Hodor's broad back. If it wasn't for Hodor's unwavering resolve, they would never have made it out of that cave. But from that day forward, he was changed. Whenever he closed his eyes, he could hear that pounding, that voice, "Hold the door, hold the door." And behind it all, a deeper whisper from something far colder, "Give in to the door. Let us in." They endured a brutal journey south with little food and almost no rest. Hodor trudged on, expression haunted, occasionally murmuring his name in a half-panicked tone. His eyes, once gentle, seemed to flicker with visions of the dead scraping against the walls of the cave. Mira noticed his trembling, how he sometimes jerked awake as though possessed. Bran, though ill from exhaustion, tried to comfort him, placing a hand on his shoulder and whispering, "It's over now, it's over," even when both knew it wasn't. There was always the sense that the White Walkers had not forsaken their search, that they were coming. Step by step, the small party pushed forward, hoping to find refuge with any friendly folk who still held to the realm of the living. But nightmares do not fade so easily. Late one night, as the aurora shimmered overhead in ghostly ribbons, Hodor found his dreams haunted by the frigid shape of the Night King, that terrible face glaring at him, mouth curling into an uncanny facsimile of a smile. In the dream, he stood alone in a frozen lake, the ice stretching in every direction until it touched the horizon. The sky was dead black, starless. Then cracks appeared beneath Hodor's feet, spiderwebbing outward, and through them, a pale hand emerged, grasping at his ankles. He tried to shout, but all that came out was Hodor, in a strangled cry. The White Walker rose from beneath the ice, silent and inexorable, reached out and laid a finger on Hodor's brow. The cold was beyond words, so intense it stole breath, thought, and life. Then, in the reflection of that cursed ice, Hodor saw himself with eyes of glacial blue. When he startled awake, he found Bran peering into his face. The boy said nothing, only wore the concerned frown, as though sensing the horror that had trailed him out of sleep. The connection Bran and Hodor shared through warging was a double-edged sword. It gave Bran a unique window into the giant's heart, but it also opened Hodor to all sorts of manipulations from those who sought to subvert Bran's power. Perhaps the Night King had discovered that. Perhaps the White Walker had found a path into Hodor's soul, wanting to transform him into an agent of the undead. And so, day by day, Hodor battled not just the physical fatigue of their escape but a relentless mental siege. They found fleeting respite in a secluded village near the last hearth, the seat of House Umber, though they learned the Umbers had marched south. The village was nearly deserted, but a few stragglers offered them crusts of bread and thin soup. The region was gripped in perpetual twilight, and rumors swirled that the White Walkers had been seen on the borders of the lands, turning entire families into whites. The villagers looked upon Hodor's enormous frame and murmured that if such a man were turned, it would be a living nightmare for all. Bran, heart-heavy, realized that more people than he knew feared this possibility. Even though they pitied Hodor, they also knew that if the White Walkers gained control over him, it might be a more dire threat than any run-of-the-mill white. The notion chilled Bran to the core. Despite the villagers' generosity, no place was safe. They had to continue south, to Winterfell if it remained in friendly hands, or beyond, to gather with the forces who might still fight the dead. Day and night, Hodor's nightmares worsened. He would whimper and moan in his sleep, big tears seeping from the corners of his closed eyes. Mira tried to calm him, wiping sweat from his brow, but each episode seemed to hollow him out. During daylight hours, he walked as though half-present, eyes glazed. She asked Bran if there was anything that could be done. Bran, with guilt in his voice, admitted he didn't know. The old three-eyed raven would have known, but he was gone. And Bran's knowledge was fragmentary, gleaned from half-finished lessons. They pressed on, uncertain. An unseasonably fierce storm rolled in one evening, blanketing the world in swirling snow. The wind whipped across the plains as they stumbled into the crumbling remnants of a holdfast. The structure had partially collapsed, but there was enough shelter to hide from the gale. Inside, the stones were frigid to the touch and the gloom was impenetrable. Hodor collapsed against a wall, exhausted. Bran, though chilled, tried to build a small fire. Mira foraged what she could, bits of dried wood from fallen beams. The wind shrieked, drowning any hope of quiet. As night fell in earnest, the temperature plummeted and they huddled around the meager flames for warmth. That was when Hodor spoke something that wasn't his name. Or almost did. A guttural rasp, a strangled attempt at speech. Mira leaned in, alarmed. "Hodor," she whispered. He nodded, tears in his eyes, struggling to form words. Bran laid a hand on his arm, eyes wide. For the briefest moment, a flicker of intelligence, of clarity, emerged in Hodor's gaze. He swallowed, large atoms apple bobbing, and parted his lips. A single syllable escaped, hoarse and trembling, unrecognizable as any word they had ever heard. But it was distinctly not Hodor. The effort seemed to tear something in him, his entire body spasmed, and he slumped forward, panting. Mira and Bran exchanged fearful looks. Whatever he had tried to say, it had demanded a price from him. He cast his gaze at Bran, anguish written across his face. It was as if he longed to warn them, to tell them of the battle raging within, of the presence that demanded he yield, open the door to let something monstrous inside. But words failed him, and he lapsed back into that simple veneer. That night, a new terror arrived. Past midnight, the storm seemed to abate, but it was only a herald for something else. Mira, taking watch, suddenly saw shapes in the drifting moonlight, silhouettes walking stiffly across the snow. She tensed, heart pounding, and shook Bran awake. "They're here," she hissed. "The dead." Bran quickly roused Hodor, who stirred clumsily. Outside, the whites converged on the holdfast, silent except for the crunch of ice beneath their feet. The undead had no voices, only the death rattle of decaying throats. And somewhere behind them, maybe hidden by the swirling drifts, might be the White Walkers themselves. They fled deeper into the holdfast, searching for a back exit. The corridors groaned under the weight of time, and collapsed sections forced them down unfamiliar hallways. Mira led, brandishing a dragon-glass dagger, while Bran guided Hodor along with hurried whispers. But Hodor lagged, as though each step cost him dearly. The presence in his mind hammered at him, a roaring avalanche that demanded his surrender. He pressed his hands to the sides of his head, muttering Hodor, Hodor, over and over in a rising panic. "We have to move," Mira urged, but the giant only moaned louder, tears running down his cheeks. Bran was torn between fear and compassion. "Hodor, please," he said, voice breaking. "We have to leave." But in Hodor's eyes was the reflection of that endless night, the White Walkers promising to free him from his torment if he would only yield. That was the moment the door behind them exploded under the force of undead hands. The whites poured in, skeletal forms and rotting flesh, eyes lusting for living warmth. Mira lunged, driving the dagger into the first one, which collapsed into a lifeless heap. Bran screamed for Hodor to follow, but the giant froze. He recalled that fateful time in the cave, the scene repeating like a broken record in his mind, the door, the hands, hold the door. He was paralyzed by the weight of the memory. The whites advanced, their numbers overwhelming. In desperation, Bran reached into Hodor's mind, attempting to warg with him, to force him to move. But the moment he did, he sensed another presence at the threshold, cold, ravenous, waiting. The White Walkers had set a trap in Hodor's mind, anticipating Bran's use of his powers. Their lure was a beckoning open door in that mental realm, a shimmering portal of black ice. If Bran entered, he would be caught as well, and so might Hodor's body become the Night King's puppet. Still, the whites came. Mira's weapon was only so effective against such a swarm. Bran felt the chill of their presence, the tangible aura of death. And so, with trembling resolve, he warged into Hodor anyway, determined to save them both or die trying. The instant he entered Hodor's consciousness, a freezing shock stabbed through him. Inside Hodor's mind was a swirling maelstrom of images, memories of the door, the stable boy's youth, the old gods, and the assaulting presence of ice that demanded submission. In that mental space, Bran saw Hodor cowering, eyes wide, as though in a corner of a vast, dark room. A jagged crack ran through the floor, from which emanated a cold so intense it burned. The shape of the Night King loomed beyond, silent, reaching out a hand. Bran projected his voice, "No. Hodor is not yours to take." A psychic struggle ensued, intangible yet fierce. The temperature in that corridor seemed to plummet further, frost creeping along the walls. Mira, in the physical realm, saw Hodor stiffen, then lash out with inhuman strength at the nearest white, crushing it to a pulp. But more swarmed in, clawing and biting. Bran tried to guide Hodor's body to fight, to push forward, to run. Yet the Night King's presence pulled in the opposite direction, seeking to anchor Hodor in place, to drown him in that black ice. It was a nightmare tug-of-war for possession of this gentle giant's soul. And all the while, Hodor moaned in wordless agony, thrashing physically as whites tore at his garments and skin. In the end, the strength of love and loyalty prevailed, if only for a moment. Bran found the core of Hodor's being, the memory of the child he once was, his name then Wylus, the stable boy who loved nothing more than the harmony of the simple life. He was not a puppet. He was kind, he was good, and in that memory Bran found a warm glow. He clung to that glow, pushing back at the frigid onslaught, shouting inwardly for Hodor to break free. The giant roared, body surging with surprising vigor, throwing whites off him. "Hodor," he bellowed, but in that sound was an undercurrent of other words, unspoken but powerful. With one enormous swing, he cleared the path. Mira grabbed Bran, who was still half lost in the warg, and they scrambled through the corridor. Hodor, bleeding and battered, stumbled after them. The trio managed to break out of a side passage into the open air. The undead hordes were momentarily behind them, but not far. Snow whipped around them, the night illuminated only by the faint glow of a dying moon. Bran slid off Hodor's back to check his injuries. Large scratches and bruises covered the giant's chest and arms, and though the cold slowed the bleeding, it was clear he was in pain. "We have to keep going," Mira said, breath steaming. So they did, with Hodor limping, stifling groans. Bran tried to support him, though his small frame could hardly do much. They managed to outdistance the immediate white assault, but their luck was fleeting. As the gray light of pre-dawn touched the horizon, a piercing cry shattered the silence. Another White Walker was close. Bran's senses, still linked partially to Hodor's mind, felt that dread presence again. The creature's call to him was like a siren's song, promising an end to all fear, an end to pain, if only he would give in. Hodor glanced at Bran, face contorted in terror. He could sense the intrusion too. "Hodor," he groaned, voice cracking. They had no choice but to run again, though they were exhausted, starved, and half-frozen. Bran's lungs burned, Mira's limbs shook, and Hodor was half-staggering. And that was when they heard the distant sound of galloping hooves. At first, they feared it was a trick, that wights on undead horses had found them. But as the riders drew nearer, a flicker of hope flared. There were torches, and the riders had faces etched with worry but undeniably human. A small band of free riders from House Mormont, perhaps, or House Stark loyalists who had ventured north. They swept in, swords and axes at the ready, driving back the small cluster of wights that had begun to reappear over a ridge. The living men formed a protective circle, ushering Bran, Mira, and Hodor to safety. Through chattering teeth, Mira explained what had happened. The riders, led by a bearded man with a sigil of a bear on his cloak, offered them assistance. They even had a pair of supply sleds. Gingerly, they placed Hodor on one, covering his massive frame with furs. Bran and Mira collapsed onto the other, grateful beyond measure. The men took them south, riding at a brisk pace, keeping watchful eyes on the swirling drifts behind. The undead, it seemed, had lost them for now, though no one believed it would be for long. A hush settled over the group, a combination of relief and simmering dread. Bran looked at Hodor, who moaned softly, his face pale. Though saved physically for the moment, the war for Hodor's spirit was not over. The White Walkers had established a foothold in his mind, a tenuous link forged by the traumatic synergy of Bran's warging and their own black magic. They intended to exploit it, to turn him, if not physically, then psychically, to their cause. And for Bran, nothing was more terrifying than that idea. They arrived at a makeshift encampment near the banks of a half-frozen river. A few tents flapped in the wind and campfires burned low. It was here that the scattered loyalists and free folk who refused to yield to the undead had gathered. The men set Hodor down gently by one of the larger fires, and a grizzled healer examined his wounds. Meanwhile, Bran spoke quietly to the commander, an older woman with a stern face and the sigil of the bear on her surcoat. "We must protect him," Bran urged, voice trembling. "The White Walkers, they want him. They can use him." The woman frowned, her eyes flicking to the giant. "Use him how?" she asked, evidently unconvinced. Mira answered, "He has a link with Bran. They want to exploit it." She hesitated, remembering the moment in the holdfast. They nearly succeeded once. Though skeptical, the commander ordered extra guards posted. A hush fell over the camp as darkness set in once more. Some of the men eyed Hodor warily, mindful of rumors that if a man so large was turned, he could wreak havoc. Hodor, for his part, lay groaning, occasionally stirring. Bran approached him, wanting to offer solace. "Hodor," Bran said gently, resting a hand on his friend's broad shoulder. "I'm here." Hodor's eyes fluttered open, full of childlike fear. "Hodor?" he repeated, searching for reassurance. Bran nodded, swallowing past the lump in his throat. He felt a swelling of gratitude and guilt. This man had saved him so many times, sacrificed so much. And now, the threat of being turned into an agent of ice loomed over him like a sword. Bran vowed he would not let it happen. Whatever it took, he would see Hodor free. That night, as the wind howled through the camp, the nightmares returned. Hodor writhed in his restless sleep. Over and over, he muttered that single syllable, Hodor, in pained gasps. Bran, too, tossed in his bedroll, haunted by visions of the Night King's glowing eyes. The hours stretched long. Guards patrolled the perimeter, watching for any sign of wights or White Walkers. The distant howling of wolves was a constant refrain, or perhaps it was the wind. It was impossible to know for sure. Then, in the gray gloom just before dawn, everything fell silent. The wind died abruptly, and the flap of the tents ceased. People awoke to an uneasy stillness. Bran sat up, heart pounding. He sensed a presence, a tremor in the realm of magic that brushed against his mind. Then came a scream. One of the guards stumbled into camp, eyes wild, babbling about shapes moving through the darkness, shapes that walked but did not live. As if on cue, silhouettes began to appear at the edge of the encampment, half hidden in swirling snow. The riders leapt into action, brandishing weapons, yelling to each other. In the commotion, no one noticed that Hodor had risen from his makeshift bed. His eyes were glazed, his face slack as though moving in a trance. Bran, just a few steps away, turned in alarm. "Hodor," he called, but the giant did not respond. Instead, he moved slowly toward the center of the camp as if guided by an invisible hand. The White Walkers had come for him. You could sense their influence, intangible but potent, like a whisper on the wind that compelled Hodor to walk. Bran scrambled forward, calling for help. Mira, rising from her own bedroll, rushed to intercept Hodor, but he brushed her aside with casual strength, sending her stumbling. The camp erupted into chaos. The undead began to swarm in. Bran heard their ghastly moans. Men shouted, steel clashed. Yet all of Bran's attention focused on Hodor, who stood now in the center of the camp, breathing heavily. Frost formed on his skin as though drawn from the very air. Mira called out to him, tears in her voice, "Hodor, you have to fight it." But the giant only groaned, his entire body shaking. Bran knew he had to act, but he also knew how dangerous warging now could be. The White Walkers had set this trap to claim Hodor fully. If Bran entered his mind, he might be directly pitting himself against them once more. Failure could mean losing not just Hodor but Bran's own consciousness as well. Still, what choice did he have? The alternative was letting the White Walkers turn Hodor into a juggernaut of frost and death, unleashing him upon the living. Summoning every ounce of courage, Bran closed his eyes, reached out, and slipped into Hodor's mind. It was as though he plunged into a raging blizzard. The cold assaulted him instantly, gnawing at his essence. In the swirling mental landscape, Hodor's presence flickered like a wounded animal. The specter of the Night King loomed, tall and cruel, whispering silent commands. The cracked floor branched out in all directions, forming a labyrinth of ice. Darkness pressed in, hungry and merciless. Hodor cowered near the center, battered by the storm, half-conscious. In that mental realm, Bran took the form of himself as he had been before his injuries, a young boy, but whole. He tried to move forward, but the wind threatened to drive him back. "Hodor, it's me," Bran shouted. He saw the giant's large, sorrowful eyes flick toward him. Then something else shifted in the blackness, a swirl of white that took shape, a wraith-like visage of the Night King. The silent figure extended an icy hand, and a jagged spear of cold erupted from the ground, aimed at Bran's heart. Bran rolled aside in that mental space, tumbling across the cracking ice. He reached out mentally to Hodor. "Remember your name," Bran pleaded. "Remember who you are." But Hodor clutched his head as though tortured by the conflicting commands of loyalty to Bran and the White Walkers' insidious magic. The storm intensified, shards of ice cutting through the air. The Night King advanced, each step resonating with finality. His eyes blazed with that pale blue glow. Bran felt fear threatening to consume him. He was just a boy, outmatched by an ancient evil. But then he remembered Hodor's faith, his unwavering devotion, how he had risked everything to protect Bran. If Hodor could do that, how could Bran fail to at least try to save him now? Forcing himself to stand, Bran held out a hand to Hodor. He funneled every bit of warmth he could muster. Memories of summer, the dire wolf, memories of Winterfell when it was still alive with laughter, memories of his family, of all he loved. He poured them into Hodor. "You saved me," Bran cried. "You protected me. I'm here for you now. Please, please come back." The swirling tempest of ice faltered for an instant, as though uncertain. Hodor lifted his head, tears freezing on his cheeks. In that fleeting moment, he recognized Bran, recognized the bond they shared, forged by love and time and suffering. The Night King scowled silently, raising both arms to unleash the full fury of winter. But Hodor roared, a deep, primal bellow of defiance. He rose in that mental landscape, dwarfing everything around him. The eyes that had been so lost now blazed with a sudden power. He lifted both great arms and slammed them down on the cracking ice, as though defying the storm. A shockwave rippled out, fracturing the illusions. The swirl of frost parted like a curtain. For an instant, the Night King's image flickered, as though losing its hold on this realm. Bran, seizing his chance, clasped Hodor's hand in that dream space. Together, they turned their defiance on the White Walker's manifestation. A cry of rage, or perhaps frustration, echoed through the void, and the icy figure disintegrated, scattering into the wind like shards of broken glass. In the physical world, it all happened in the space of a heartbeat. Hodor, who had stood transfixed in the center of camp, eyes glazed, suddenly shuddered and let out a thunderous roar. The frost on his skin melted, replaced by sweat. He took a step forward, nearly collapsing, but Mira and Bran caught him. All around them, the skirmish continued. The White Walkers had not fully appeared, but whites attacked relentlessly, shrieking as they flung themselves at the defenders. Yet in that moment, it felt as though a victory had been won. Hodor's soul was his own again, and the White Walkers' plan to claim him had been thwarted. He turned, chest heaving, to face a group of whites. With tears still streaming, he swung his arm in a massive blow, scattering the undead like straw. The defenders rallied around him, emboldened by his raw strength. Axes rose, arrows flew, and bit by bit, they pushed the whites back, forcing them away from the flickering torches of the camp. By dawn's full light, the undead had retreated or been destroyed. The living were left exhausted, many wounded, some dead. But they had survived the night. And Hodor, battered in spirit and flesh, stood among them. No longer just a simple stable boy who said one word, but something more. A symbol of resilience. Men who once feared him now looked at him with respect, if not awe. He had torn whites apart with his bare hands, roared louder than any war horn, and refused to yield to the White Walkers' mental enslavement. Bran, leaning heavily against Mira, approached Hodor. The giant looked down, trembling as though he might collapse. "Hodor," he murmured, the word half-broken. Bran let his tears fall. "You did it," he whispered. "You fought them off." Hodor's lip quivered. "Hodor," he managed, confusion in his tone, but also the faintest trace of relief. Bran reached up, placed a hand on Hodor's broad chest. "Yes," Bran said, voice raw. "Thank you. We're safe. Because of you." The giant's shoulders heaved with silent sobs, tears mingling with the blood and sweat on his face. He closed his eyes, letting out a long, shaky breath. The mental link had been severed, for now. He was free from their hold, though the cost of that freedom was etched in every trembling muscle. In the following days, the camp regrouped. Some riders were sent out to scout for further signs of the undead. Supplies were rationed carefully. The wounded were tended. In hushed conversations around the fires, the story spread. How the White Walkers had tried to claim the enormous stable boy, how he had nearly become a weapon of unstoppable might, how he overcame their hold in the last heartbeat, turning the tide of the battle. Rumors began to swirl that perhaps there was more to Hodor than met the eye, that in a time before memory, he might have been touched by some primal force, and that was why he had been so vulnerable to the White Walker's magic. Others said it was all just a fluke of warging magic gone awry. But whenever someone asked Bran about it, he would only say, "He's my friend. He saved me. That's all that matters." Time crawled. Hodor bore the scars of the encounter, physically and mentally. At night, he still jolted awake, fear flashing across his face as though expecting the Night King to rise up from the shadows. Mira would place a calming hand on his arm, and he would settle. The nightum. Ares remained, but their intensity lessened day by day. Bran and Hodor no longer dared attempt warging unless absolutely necessary, fearing any further opening could give the White Walkers another chance. But there was a bond between them now stronger than any words. Hodor sensed that Bran cared deeply for him, that he was not just a beast of burden but a comrade in arms, an integral piece in the battle for the realm. No one could say for certain if the White Walkers would abandon their pursuit of Hodor. They were relentless, after all, and cunning. But for the moment, the giant was safe among allies who would stand between him and that horrific fate. The prospect of the final confrontation with the army of the dead loomed on the horizon, an inevitable crescendo of doom. And when that day came, Hodor would be ready to fight as fiercely as any knight, not as a puppet of the cold but as a champion of the living, a gentle soul who chose defiance rather than surrender. In the weeks that followed, the camp joined forces with other northern houses that had banded together. Hodor traveled with them, still occasionally lost in that single repeated word, but carrying himself with a new quiet dignity. Bran noticed how the others looked upon him, some with lingering fear, but most with gratitude or admiration. He had become a living testament to how even the kindest, most unassuming among them could be targeted by the looming terror. In the face of that threat, every person's strength mattered. Every flicker of resistance was a candle in the dark. Eventually, the group reached a larger assembly of forces loyal to House Stark. Generals conferred about strategies against the White Walkers, forging alliances with the Free Folk and the Knights of the Vale. Tents sprawled across a windswept plain. War horns occasionally sounded in the distance as outriders reported sightings of undead gatherings. Bran reunited with some of his siblings who were relieved to see him alive, though horrified by the trials he had endured. They looked at Hodor with fresh eyes, no longer just the sweet man who once carried a young crippled boy through Winterfell's halls, but a survivor of unimaginable mental warfare. Winter, in all its savagery, had come. But so too had resilience. Hodor, still repeating his name, was a reminder that every life was precious and had the power to stand against the icy tide. Though quiet and childlike, he had stood in the threshold between the living and the dead, refused to let the door open to darkness. Yes, the White Walkers had tried to mold him into a weapon. But they failed, for the spark of humanity within him was stronger than the chill that gnawed at his heart. And so, in the final reckoning that would soon be upon them, Hodor would stand with the living. If he was fated to face the White Walkers again, he would do so not as their thrall but as a bulwark against the night. A testament that even the simplest among us can bear the greatest burdens and that no mind is so broken that it cannot choose the light over the dark. He had learned fear, yes, but he had also learned courage. He had been touched by the shadows of an ancient evil, but he had found warmth in the loyalty of a young lord and the friends who fought beside him. Whenever darkness threatened to descend on his mind, he remembered that he was not alone. The question lingered for many who heard the tale: was Hodor meant to be a weapon for the White Walkers? Some claimed it was fate, that his size and the brand of hidden magic was no coincidence, that the others had always intended to bend him to their will. Others argued that Hodor had always been meant to save Bran Stark, that his entire life's path led him to that crucial moment of heroism. In truth, perhaps both were correct. Fate is not always an either-or prophecy, it is often a tapestry of choices and possibilities. The White Walkers might have seen a powerful tool, but that did not mean Hodor had to become it. Freed will remain the bulwark. With the help of Bran and his own deep well of devotion, Hodor forged his own path. The armies of men gathered, forging swords of dragon steel, fortifying walls, sending ravens across the realm. The tension was palpable. The frosts deepened, turning rivers to thick ice. Skies were iron-gray, days short and nights brutally long. Yet there was a unity among the living. They told stories around campfires to bolster courage, of heroes from the age of heroes, of the children of the forest's sacrifices, and now of the simple giant who had bested the Night King's intrusion. Hodor would sit by those fires, listening quietly, occasionally letting out a soft Hodor that would bring a smile to people's faces. In that small refuge of humanity's camaraderie, they found hope. For if Hodor, gentle and frightened, could withstand the darkest magic, perhaps they too could stand against the approaching horde. Perhaps each of them carried a spark strong enough to hold back the endless night. Yes, the White Walkers would come again, unstoppable and merciless. But the living had heart and courage, bonds of friendship and love. Those intangible weapons might prove stronger than any blade. That was the promise whispered in the hush before the final storm, the solace taken by soldiers who dreaded the day the White Walkers arrived in full force. Even if the living fell, they would fall fighting side by side, refusing to let that door swing open to extinguish all light from the world. When the final confrontation did arrive, it was near the broken ruins of a once grand castle, its identity lost in the swirling snows of time. Battle lines formed at dawn, though the sky was so overcast it remained as dark as twilight. Bran stood behind the main ranks, guarded by loyal knights, for his powers might prove decisive. Hodor, unarmored except for thick leathers, stood near him, hands clenched. Ice crunched underfoot as the living waited, hearts pounding. The wind seemed to moan with anticipation. Then shapes appeared on the horizon, countless wights, a sea of them, accompanied by tall, thin figures astride skeletal horses. The White Walkers had arrived. Slowly, methodically, they advanced. The tension in the air was suffocating. A horn sounded from the living's flank. Archers drew. The White Walkers halted as though surveying their prey. One of them, perhaps a lieutenant of the Night King, lifted a slim, pale blade. And with that gesture, the whites charged as one, an unholy tide of death. The living loosed arrows, launched flaming projectiles, roared battle cries. Steel met bone, men screamed, the clash of war echoing across the plain. The White Walkers themselves rode around the flanks, using their dreaded ice magic to shatter defenses. Chaos reigned. Horses and direwolves joined the fray, snarling. Everywhere, the living fought for their very existence. Amid the turmoil, Bran concentrated, trying to warg into ravens and scout the battlefield from above. He needed to locate the Night King or at least disrupt the White Walkers' leadership. Hodor remained by Bran's side at first, fending off whites that broke through the lines. He swung a huge club, each blow sending rotting corpses flying. Blood and ice chips flew. It was a horrifying dance of violence. But the real threat was the White Walker who had singled them out, the same that had tried to claim Hodor's mind. With a preternatural grace, the Walker dismounted, walking slowly toward them. Its eyes glowed like ice-blue torches fixed on Hodor. With a silent motion, it raised its blade. Fear roiled in Hodor's eyes, but so did a grim determination. "Hodor," he whispered as if to steel himself. Bran, startled out of his warging, cried, "Hodor, get back." But the giant did not retreat. He stepped forward, club raised. The White Walker advanced, sword shining with unnatural cold. Steel met wood. The club shattered in an explosion of freezing shards. Hodor reeled back, howling in pain as frostbitten splinters sliced his arm. With an eerie calm, the Walker aimed its sword for a killing stroke. Bran, heart-pounding, scrambled for a dragonglass dagger at his belt. He fumbled, hands shaking, too far away to intervene. But Hodor, ignoring the pain, bellowed and lunged barehanded. It was a reckless move, but fueled by desperation and the lingering warmth of humanity's hope. In that moment, the White Walker brought down the blade. It sliced across Hodor's forearm, sending up a wisp of frozen mist. But Hodor seized the Walker's arm with his other hand, roaring. Their eyes locked. In the shining reflection of the Walker's gaze, Hodor glimpsed that swirling darkness that had once threatened to consume him. Now, though, he was not alone. He felt the presence of Bran behind him, Mira's memory encouraging him, and all those who believed in him. With a monumental heave, Hodor twisted, forcing the Walker's arm downward. The creature hissed, an awful, grating sound. Bran rushed forward, brandishing the dragonglass dagger. He drove it into the Walker's side. The effect was immediate. The creature's entire form cracked and exploded into icy shards, dispersing into the wind. Hodor stared at his wounded arm, at the place where the Walker's sword had bitten deep. Frost rimed the wound, and blood trickled. He sagged to his knees, trembling. Bran dropped the dagger and knelt beside him, tears in his eyes. "Hodor, you did it," he breathed. "You did it." The giant moaned, eyes glassy. Yet there was triumph in that moan. The White Walker who had tried to claim him was gone, undone by the synergy of Hodor's raw strength and Bran's quick strike. The victory was singular and personal, yet the battle around them raged on. More whites pressed in, shrieking and howling. Bran signaled for reinforcements, and men rushed to surround them, forming a protective ring. Hodor's arm was badly wounded, but he was alive, free. Even in the midst of the Great War, that moment stood out, when the one who was once thought to be nothing more than a simpleton stableboy overcame the dark destiny the White Walkers had laid upon him. If it had been up to their cold design, he would have become their champion, a mammoth tool of destruction. Instead, he stood, battered and bloody, as a champion of the living, refusing to yield to the call of the grave. Bran clutched Hodor's large hand, tears mingling with dirt on his cheeks, and he realized that for all his powers and visions, nothing was more profound than the simple courage of Hodor's heart. By the day's end, the living held the field. The White Walkers withdrew into the blizzard. Their undead horde diminished. Losses were high on both sides, but the fact that men still breathed at sunset was a testament to the fierce will of the defenders. Hodor, carried away from the front lines by a group of soldiers, received what healing could be mustered. The slash from the ice sword had blackened the flesh around it with cold burn, and it would leave a terrible scar. But he would live, and each time someone asked him if he was well, he would nod, murmuring his single word. A quiet smile sometimes touched his lips, as though he understood more than he could say. In the days that followed, the final push against the White Walkers took shape, culminating in the epic clash that would decide the fate of the realm. But the story of that last stand could fill volumes. This tale is about Hodor, about whether he was meant to be a weapon for the White Walkers. In a sense, yes, they tried with all their might to twist him into an unstoppable force of destruction. They recognized in his gentle heart a unique vulnerability, an opening in time and magic that might be exploited. Yet in the end, the choice was his, fortified by the bond he shared with Bran and others who loved him. He refused the White Walkers. Despite the nightmares, the illusions, the savage intrusion into his mind, he stood on the side of life. Sometimes in the quiet after the battles, Hodor would rest and stare at the sky. Though he never gained back full speech, there was a serenity in his gaze. He had faced unimaginable terror both from within and without and come out stronger in spirit. The men around him came to respect him, even revere him. He may only say one word, they would remark, but he speaks volumes. And whenever he passed by, those who had witnessed his triumph might bow their heads in acknowledgement, for they knew that a simple stable boy had confronted the heart of winter and not broken. In a war that took so many lives, that defiled so many bodies, turning them into undead husks, Hodor remained a shining example that the enemy did not have to define you, that even if fate seemingly marked you for darkness, you could fight your way back to the light with the help of your friends. And so the question, was Hodor meant to be a weapon for the White Walkers, found its answer on the battlefield and in the hearts of all who survived. He could have been. But he was not. Because he chose otherwise, and that choice echoed through the north like a clarion call of hope. If even the simplest, gentlest soul could spurn the White Walker's hold, perhaps the entire realm could stand against the tide. And so the gentle giant, once considered useless save for carrying burdens and repeating a strange single word, became a mythic figure in the annals of the war against the dead. Mothers told their children how a brave man named Hodor refused to bow to evil. Warriors admired his strength of spirit. And those who truly knew him saw in his simple smile that he still remained the same kind soul, unchanged by the brush with darkness, save for a deeper sadness and wisdom in his eyes. He had found something within himself that was far greater than fear. To the end of his days, Hodor's story reminded the living that no prophecy was absolute, that destiny could be shaped by the choices one made, the love one gave, and the loyalties one kept. The White Walkers had sought to brand him as their instrument, but they had underestimated the resilience of a heart that, while childlike, was also brave and loyal beyond measure. In the epic tapestry of that war, Hodor stood for the idea that fate could be challenged, that even a single syllable, repeated endlessly, could reverberate with meaning far beyond what anyone had imagined. For Hodor was not just a name, it was the echo of a promise that he would hold the door against the darkness and never let it in. He had found something within himself that was far greater than fear. Hodor, always the gentle giant with a single word name, now carried in his massive chest the echoes of 1,000 battles he had never asked for. He had been touched by darkness and refused it, had wrestled with the White Walker's icy grasp and broken free. There was a quiet pride in the set of his broad shoulders, a humble acceptance in his kind eyes, though the countless bruises and the rough scars on his skin told of the heavy price he had paid. Word had spread among soldiers and refugees alike that Hodor had once stood on the brink of becoming a weapon for the White Walkers, that they had tried to bend him to their will. He could have become their monstrous champion. Instead, he had roared back, forging his own path. Now, in this tenuous respite before the next wave of war, he crouched near a brazier of glowing coals, rubbing his wounded forearm and gazing up at the lowering sky. Winter had turned the land into a barren, glacial expanse. The sun rose weak and pale, crossing the sky like a hesitant traveler, always in a rush to vanish beyond the horizon. In the waking hours, the wind cut like knives. At night, it screamed in eerie gusts that rattled tents and made men huddle in their cloaks. The scattered armies of men, dwarfed by the colossal scale of their own desperation, had assembled on this freezing plain by happenstance. Some had trickled in after hearing rumors of a standing encampment, others had fled from further north, spurred by terror and the near certainty that the undead lurked in every shadow. Tents clustered around half-frozen streams where water was collected by hacking away chunks of ice. Horses stamped the ground, uneasy, sensing the doom that pressed on all sides. Archers set their fletching with shaking fingers, blacksmiths hammered out new blades from whatever scraps they could salvage, forging steel that might hold a single edge against an unstoppable foe. Near one of the larger fires, Bran Stark sat in conversation with Mira Reed. They were older than when their journey had first begun, and the hardships they had endured were etched in their faces. Yet there was something indomitable in Bran's gaze, a quiet concentration that radiated knowledge beyond his years. He had grown in power, though the cost of that power weighed on him like a millstone. Mira, ever steadfast, kept a protective arm on his shoulder whenever he wavered. They spoke of many things, scouting reports that suggested the White Walkers had pulled back to reorganize, uncertain alliances with southern lords who hadn't yet committed troops, the possibility of forging new dragonglass weapons. But more than anything, they spoke of Hodor. "He's not sleeping well," Mira said softly, passing a bowl of thin stew to Bran. "He tosses and turns, and sometimes he moans as if reliving the worst horrors. He still fights them in his dreams, I think." Bran nodded, eyes flicking toward the giant. "I can feel the echoes of it," he replied, voice low. "Even without warging, there's a bond. He was close, so close to being taken. If not for his own stubborn strength," Bran exhaled. "We must be on guard. The White Walkers won't give up easily. They know he's more than he seems." Mira looked grim. "When the final battle comes, they may try again. Maybe not the same way, not by direct possession, but by turning him with a single scratch if they can, or by wearing him down until he's too weak to resist. We have to keep him safe, for his sake and for ours." They said no more, for the swirl of the camp around them demanded their attention. A ragged group of free folk had arrived from the west, leading scrawny horses and carrying warnings of roving bands of whites. The men of the encampment stirred to readiness, shifting into a more cohesive formation. War horns occasionally sounded in the distance, their lonely cries echoing off the icy ridges. The camp was on a knife's edge. Every face reflected the same unspoken question: when would the Night King come in force? And would they be prepared? Hodor, as though sensing the tension, rose to his full height by the brazier. He looked around, blinking sleep from his eyes, wearing a cloak far too small for his frame. The wind ruffled his white hair. He mumbled, Hodor, half a question. A young soldier, barely more than a boy, came closer to offer him a bowl of water. People did that often now, some out of pity, others out of silent gratitude. Hodor accepted the bowl with a shy nod, repeating his name in a soft murmur. The boy, clearly in awe, scurried away, unsure how to converse with a man who answered nearly every inquiry with only that single word. But Hodor did not seem lonely, not truly. He had Mira and he had Bran, and in many ways, the entire encampment had become a vast, if fractious, family. The knights from the Vale offered archery lessons to the free folk from beyond the wall. Hill tribesmen from the west joined up with ire-born reavers who had once been their sworn enemies. They all had reason enough to put aside old grudges. This was not a war of men fighting men, or lords squabbling for titles. This was a war of survival. The final enemy cared nothing for gold or banners. Any living thing it touched would become an extension of its cold will. News arrived one morn. Riding on the lips of a battered scout who nearly froze to death on his way into camp. He brought word that a large portion of the undead host had been sighted to the north, massing on a frozen lake. Even more ominously, rumors suggested that the Night King himself was present, gathering strength for a decisive push. Panic rippled through the camp at this announcement. Soldiers exchanged uneasy looks, some prayed to the old gods, others to the Seven, to the Lord of Light, to any deity who might grant a miracle. The newly forged alliances wavered under the sudden fear that they might all be consumed in a single night. Commanders debated whether to hold their ground or retreat further south, but with winter's teeth so firmly entrenched, flight was nearly impossible. Resources were scarce, many men's feet were already blackened with frostbite, and the horses were too thin to carry everyone. Besides, the White Walkers would not be deterred by distance. They would come eventually. If the living fled, they would merely postpone the inevitable. Bran listened to these counsels with haunted eyes. He tapped into the edges of his gift, searching for glimpses of the Night King's movements in his visions, but after that fateful encounter in Hodor's mind, he dared not push too far. The risk was too great. Yet he caught fleeting images, the rattle of ice, the hiss of frozen wind, an army in tattered ranks marching under the aurora of the endless night. Whenever he surfaced from those visions, he was trembling. Mira would help him find his bearings, and Hodor would hover nearby, protective. The big man sensed Bran's distress instantly, as though attuned to his every breath. As the days passed and the final confrontation loomed nearer, the mood in camp shifted from fear to a grim determination. More smiths arrived, bringing with them a stash of dragonglass from the Isle of Dragonstone. A portion of the men trained relentlessly in how best to wield the brittle black material. Dragonglass arrowheads were fashioned, spears and short daggers sharpened. Others set to reinforcing the perimeter with crude spikes and pits, though no one was quite sure how effective such defenses would be against a foe that felt no pain, needed no rest, and advanced with unholy persistence. Hodor was given a dragonglass-tipped hammer. It was a crude weapon, cobbled together by one of the blacksmiths who hammered a thick chunk of obsidian into a roughly wedge-shaped head, then attached it to a stout wooden haft. The men who built it weren't certain it would last a single battle, but if Hodor could land a decisive blow on one of the White Walkers, the chance was worth it. He held it in his huge hands, turning it this way and that, uncertain. Hodor, he muttered as if questioning the dull sheen of the black glass. Bran explained gently, "This is for you. Dragonglass can kill White Walkers. You saw what it did to the one you and I defeated together. Now you have a weapon of your own." Hodor looked up at Bran, tears in his eyes. He nodded, hugging the hammer to his chest. The gesture was both comical and tragic, like a child clinging to a treasured plaything. Yet the hammered edges could end an immortal foe in the blink of an eye. The day of the attack came sooner than anyone anticipated. It started with an otherworldly hush that settled over the plain. No wind stirred, no animals called. Soldiers woke to stillness so profound it rang in their ears. Hodor, who usually rose late, sprang from his makeshift bedding, hammer in hand, his body tense. Bran and Meera shared a look of alarm. "They're here, aren't they?" Meera whispered. Bran merely nodded, words lost. An ominous gloom had swallowed the sky, blotting out the faint sunrise. Men rushed to their posts, forming lines of spears and shields, while archers scrambled to the higher ground, arrow quivers rattling. War horns blew, echoing across the emptiness with a sound that vibrated in every rib cage. Then, through the icy haze, the first shapes emerged, whites marching in uneven ranks, some armed with rusted swords, others with no weapons at all, their skeletal fingers outstretched. The sight was enough to send shivers through even the bravest hearts. They came in staggering numbers, too many to count, a wave of silent malice. At intervals among them strode White Walkers, tall and gaunt, each armed with a sword of ice that shimmered with lethal magic. And, at a distance, the faint silhouette of something larger, darker, the Night King's presence, or perhaps one of his lieutenants, was not entirely clear through the swirling gloom, but everyone could sense it. In the living ranks, tension snapped taut. Orders were shouted. Archers released their first volley of flaming arrows, but the Whites did not slow. Some were pierced and fell, but they crawled forward still, lifeless eyes fixed on the living. Meera was near the front, armed with her dragonglass spear, scanning for any sign of White Walkers to strike. Bran, protected by a group of loyal men, clutched the straps of his own coat, trying to keep calm. He would not risk warging unless it became absolutely necessary. Hodor stood beside him, massive hammer grip tight, breathing in ragged gasps. His gaze flicked nervously across the oncoming tide of undead, and from his lips came the repeated murmur, "Hodor, Hodor," a mantra that steadied him in the face of nightmares. The clash began with a hideous roar. Whites collided with the front lines of men, fleshless jaws snapping, arms flailing. Steel rang on bone. The living cried out as they fought to hold the line. The rancid stench of death rose everywhere, combining with the metallic tang of blood and the hiss of frost underfoot. Hodor hovered near Bran, smashing aside any White that managed to push past the defenders. The brute strength of his blows sent them flying in pieces, but each strike reverberated up his arms, causing him to grunt in pain. He refused to yield. The memory of near possession fueled him. He would not let these monsters conquer him or anyone else. With each swing, he remembered that the White Walkers had tried to enslave him, but he had said no. That defiance roared in every muscle, in every bellow that burst from his lungs. He swung the dragonglass hammer, crushed a White's torso, and watched in grim satisfaction as it collapsed, unmoving. But the press of the dead was too heavy. The first ranks of defenders began to buckle under sheer numbers. Some men fell, screaming, and were dragged under. Others retreated to keep from being surrounded. The White Walkers themselves advanced like silent sentinels, stepping over the broken forms of the Whites as though they were inconsequential. Their icy swords flashed. Wherever they strode, men broke and fled if they lacked the means to fight them. The wind began to swirl again, no longer still but rising in howling gusts. Snow battered the combatants. Visibility diminished. Shouts got lost in the din. Bran lost sight of Meera among the chaos, fear twisting his stomach. He called for her but got no reply. Hodor felt Bran's tension and reached out with one giant hand, grasping Bran's shoulder to keep him close. He muttered Hodor as though asking if they should flee. Bran swallowed hard, meeting the giant's gaze. "We stand," Bran said, voice shaky yet resolute. "We stand here." And so they did. The line of living men reformed around them, battered but not broken. Archers atop small ridges loosed volley after volley, aiming for the White Walkers with dragonglass-tipped arrows, hoping for a lucky strike. Now and then a crackling hiss sounded, and a White Walker shattered under a direct hit, spraying shards of ice across the battlefield. Each time that happened, cheers rose from those who witnessed it, a spark of hope in the gloom. But for each White Walker destroyed, more Whites poured in. The tide was unrelenting. Through the swirling snow, a figure appeared, a White Walker of unusual height, gaunter and more menacing than the rest. Its eyes burned with a malevolent blue glow. Ice crystals trailed around it, forming a miniature tempest. And in its grasp it carried not a sword but a spear of translucent ice. Hodor froze at the sight, his breath catching. Something in the White Walker's bearing reminded him of the horror he'd faced in the labyrinth of his own mind. Perhaps this was the same presence that had once tried to usurp him. Bran sensed it too, a fierce wave of cold that pressed against his mind. He clenched his jaw, focusing on the present, trying not to let his fear overshadow him. The White Walker raised its spear, pointed it directly at Hodor, and advanced. The whites around it parted as though directed by an unspoken command. A hush fell on that section of the battlefield. Even the living men near Bran drew back, for the aura of the Walker's power was suffocating. Hodor stood tall, heart pounding, hammer quivering in his hands. The memory of that psychic assault flared within him, but he was not the same man who cowered in the corner of his mind. He had fought free once. Could he do it again? Bran, voice taut, whispered, "Hodor, we can't let this one through. You know what he can do." The giant nodded resolutely, tears forming at the corners of his eyes. He gripped the hammer with both hands. Around them, the men reformed a loose circle, waiting, uncertain if they could help or if this was to be Hodor's personal battle. The White Walker closed the distance in unnerving silence. Its head tilted, and though it made no sound, the tension in the air suggested it was testing Hodor's will, pushing against him with intangible force. In that moment, Hodor felt a jab in his skull, a faint echo of that old intrusion. He gasped, stumbling backward, nearly toppling Bran. The White Walker did not rush to strike. Instead, it paused, allowing that mental infiltration to do its work. Hodor's breath came faster. He pressed one massive hand to his temple, moaning in confusion. "Hodor! Hod," he choked, eyes brimming with dread. Bran placed a hand on his side, as high as he could reach, trying to anchor him. "Fight it, Hodor," he urged. "Fight it like you did before. You're stronger now." But Hodor's mind was swirling. He saw himself alone on that frozen lake of nightmares, the ice cracking, bony hands grasping from below. The White Walker beckoned, offering oblivion or subjugation. Summoning every bit of courage he possessed, Bran reached out with his own gift, lightly touching Hodor's consciousness, offering comfort rather than seizing control. A wave of warmth and memory poured from Bran, old Winterfell, the stableyard, the laughter of children. It was not a forceful warging attempt but a gentle sharing of recollection, reminding Hodor of who he was, where he came from, and who loved him. Hodor's eyes squeezed shut, tears freezing on his lashes. Then he exhaled a breath so mighty that it seemed to shake his entire body. He stepped forward, raised the dragonglass hammer, and roared an incoherent challenge that echoed across the snowy field. The White Walker's head twitched almost in puzzlement, then it hurled the spear of ice. The spear moved faster than any mortal arm could have thrown it. Hodor barely managed to twist aside. The spear grazed his shoulder, slicing through cloak and flesh in a flurry of frost, before embedding in the ground with a sharp crack. Pain flared up Hodor's arm, but he refused to crumble. He kept his momentum, charging forward with thunderous steps. The White Walker drew a secondary blade from beneath its swirling cloak of ice, raising it to parry. Hodor swung the hammer with all his might. The Walker sidestepped, swift as a ghost, leaving the hammer's blow to strike only air. In retaliation, it slashed out with the ice blade, forcing Hodor to stagger back, narrowly evading a death blow. The ring of watchers trembled, uncertain whether to rush in or stay back. Sometimes too many swords can hinder as much as help in such a duel, particularly when the foe radiated supernatural cold. But a few men with dragonglass arrows dared to knock them, though they held their shot, afraid of hitting Hodor by accident. The giant and the Walker circled each other, snow swirling around their feet. Then Hodor lunged again, the hammer making a whooshing arc that crackled with hidden power. This time, the White Walker blocked with its blade, sending shockwaves of icy shards outward. The hammer chipped, but it did not shatter. The pair pushed against each other for a tense moment, Hodor's raw might against the Walker's unnatural strength. In that clash, the air itself seemed to quake. Suddenly, the White Walker jerked backward, sliding away as if carried by a gust of wind. It raised its free hand, pointing 2 fingers at Hodor. Without a sound, an invisible surge of cold radiated forward. Hodor gasped as he felt that mental presence try to drag him down again. He stumbled, dropping to one knee. Bran cried out, wanting to help. If he tried to warg fully, he might open both their minds to the Night King. But if he did nothing, Hodor might be lost. Heart-pounding, Bran pressed his hand to Hodor's back, pushing out a wave of pure memory once more. This time, he poured in the recollection of how Hodor had held the door, saving them all from the whites at the cave, how that selflessness defined him. He was not just a victim or a pawn, he was their shield, their friend, their hero. Hodor's eyes flared with renewed light. Roaring, he rose from his knee, ignoring the black frost creeping along the wound on his shoulder. With a final, desperate surge, he hefted the hammer and swung it in a massive overhead blow. The White Walker moved to dodge, but Hodor adjusted mid-swing, driving the obsidian wedge clean into its chest. For an instant it seemed as if the hammer might bounce harmlessly away. Then a high, keening sound filled the air. The walker's torso cracked like glass, fissures spreading in a brilliant pattern. A shriek, silent yet deafening, rippled across the battlefield. The walker shattered in a spray of ice and vapor, fragments scattering at Hodor's feet. A hush fell as if the entire world held its breath. Hodor stood panting, hammer poised, tears streaking his face. Bran stared up at him, awe and relief mingled in his expression. A ragged cheer arose from the nearby men who had watched the spectacle with dread. The giant had done the impossible again, defied the White Walker's mental intrusion and destroyed one of their champions in personal combat. The triumph was short-lived, however, for the battle still raged all around them. Whites continued to surge and other White Walkers roamed the field, sowing horror with each step. But something had shifted. The living had seen Hodor's victory and it ignited a flicker of hope in their hearts. In the roiling chaos that followed, the defenders found new strength. They pressed forward, using dragonglass weapons to dispatch Whites more efficiently. Archers focused their aim on the White Walkers whenever they saw an opening. The tide, while not turning definitively, at least no longer seemed unstoppable. Some pockets of the undead line faltered, especially when a White Walker leading them was destroyed. For a moment, it seemed the living might hold, might even push back the frozen tide. Then a thunderous roar tore across the plain. The sound did not come from the throats of men or Whites, but from the swirling storm clouds overhead. The wind whipped to a frenzy, and swirling columns of snow descended onto the battlefield, forming near whirlwinds of ice. Men stumbled, lost their footing. Horses screamed, rearing in panic. The Whites pressed the advantage, hacking at any who faltered. And then, through the howling wind, a monstrous shape emerged. An undead giant, one of the old free folk colossuses, bigger than Hodor by half, with rotting flesh and hollow eye sockets that glowed with malignant light. Clasped in its giant hands was a crudely fashioned club of frozen wood and ice shards. It bellowed, shaking the earth, and charged toward the living lines, sweeping men aside as if they were toys. Panic erupted anew. Archers tried to bring down the giant with arrows, but each shot only added more black-feathered pincushions to its massive form. The undead giant raged on, unstoppable. Hodor watched in horror as it decimated the left flank, scattering defenders who screamed and fled. The undead giant's gaze fell on the cluster around Bran. With a roar, it began lumbering in their direction, each stride sending up gouts of snow. Hodor's heart hammered in his chest. Another giant, a monstrous reflection of what he himself could have become. Its mouth hung open in a perpetual moan. Bits of decaying hair clung to its scalp, and an entire side of its face was caved in, revealing the glimmer of bone. The sight was horrific. A few men tried to intercept the creature, thrusting spears of dragonglass, but they were brushed aside with chilling ease. Bran's protectors formed a line, but fear radiated from them. Hodor realized, in a rush, that if he did not act, the undead giant would reach Bran. And if the White Walkers seized Bran or simply killed him, all might be lost, for Bran was not just a boy now. He was the one with knowledge of their vulnerabilities, the one who might guide them to ultimate victory. Summoning the courage that had guided him thus far, Hodor hefted his hammer again, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, and trudged forward to meet the undead giant. Bran called after him, "Hodor, no!" But the giant did not stop. Each step felt like moving against a raging current, and the swirling wind stung his eyes, but he pressed on. The undead behemoth took notice and let out a guttural sound, almost a laugh. It raised its club, an enormous trunk of splintered wood topped with jagged ice. For an instant, Hodor faltered. Could he truly stand against such a creature? Memories of Winterfell stables flashed across his mind, reminding him that he was just a stable boy once, good for feeding horses and carrying small children. But then he remembered all that had happened since. He was not just that boy anymore. He had faced the White Walker's mind assault and broken free. He had stood in the gap to protect those he loved. He was bigger than his fear, bigger even than the monstrous foe looming before him. The clash was brutal. The undead giant swung its club in a sweeping arc. Hodor ducked, though the wind of the strike knocked him sideways into the snow. He scrambled up, hammered the dragoglass wedge into the giant's hip, but the blow did not land cleanly. The undead giant roared, bringing its club down like a falling oak. Hodor rolled clear at the last instant, snow exploding around him. He swung again, aiming for the creature's knee. The hammer struck home, sending cracks across the rotting flesh, but it wasn't enough to fell the monster. With a flailing kick, the giant sent Hodor skidding across the ground. Pain flared in Hodor's ribs. He coughed, gasping, but forced himself to stand. Hodor, he growled, breath ragged, as if telling himself not to give up. Around them, the battlefield churned. Men died, whites fell, White Walkers hissed in the distance. Bran, wide-eyed, tried to inch closer, but a swirl of whites blocked his path. He called out, but his voice was lost in the din. The undead giant advanced on Hodor again, raising its club overhead. Hodor braced himself and, in an almost miraculous burst of agility, lunged forward before the club could descend. He smashed the hammer into the giant's chest with a thunderous impact. The obsidian wedge sank deep, black shards lodging in rotten flesh and bone. A surge of unnatural shrieking filled the air. The undead giant staggered, reeling backward. Hodor pulled the hammer free with a suck. Ing sound, raising it for another strike. But the giant recovered fast, swinging its club in a desperate sweep that caught Hodor across the thigh. Pain erupted, sending him sprawling again. In that moment, as he lay stunned, the undead giant bellowed anew and lifted its foot to crush him into the snow. Hodor blinked blood and snowflakes from his eyes. Time seemed to slow. He saw the massive foot looming above, the bones protruding from half-decayed skin, felt the thunder of the giant's rage. He heard the frantic shouts of men, the roars of the dying. He remembered how he'd once held the door to save Bran, how he'd refused to open his mind to the White Walker's grasp. Now he faced a far more physical threat, but the principle was the same: stand firm, or all is lost. Gritting his teeth, ignoring the agony, he raised the hammer in both hands just as the foot came down. With every ounce of strength, he drove the dragoglass wedge into the rotting soul, which split open like a burst wineskin. A hideous moan ripped across the battlefield. The undead giant staggered, nearly toppling, as blackened ooze gushed from the wound. Hodor seized the chance. Despite the searing pain in his thigh, he scrambled to his feet and limped around the giant's flailing leg. Dragging the hammer behind him, he circled around to the creature's back. The giant jerked wildly, trying to keep balance, but Hodor summoned the last of his reserves. With a guttural bellow, he swung upward, planting the hammer into the base of the giant's spine. There was a sickening crunch, and the dragoglass shard found its mark. A wave of cold energy erupted from the impact, and for a split second, the undead giant glowed with an eerie blue aura before it collapsed, shaking the ground so violently that men half a field away felt the tremor. Hodor staggered, dropping the hammer, and fell to his knees. His breath tore from his lungs, his heartbeat thundered in his ears, and he wasn't sure if he could stand again. But the undead giant did not rise. Its limbs lay splayed, lifeless at last. Shouts of triumph erupted from the nearby soldiers, a fleeting burst of morale. Bran, at last managing to push through the swirl of whites, reached Hodor's side. He placed trembling hands on the giant's broad back. "Hodor," Bran whispered, voice choked with emotion. "You did it. You killed the giant." Hodor turned, tears streaking the dirt on his face, managing a faint, exhausted smile. The pain in his thigh and shoulder was overwhelming, but a deeper relief welled within him. Another White Walker's plan, another attempt at turning him into a broken ruin, had failed. He was still himself. Their reprieve was momentary, for the battlefield was far from quiet. More whites advanced, and though the undead giant was down, smaller skirmishes raged across the frozen plain. Overhead, the storm churned, swirling with an intensity that suggested the Night King might be on the brink of some new magic. Lightning flickered once, unnaturally blue, illuminating a distant shape in the haze. Bran squinted, heart pounding. Was that the Night King himself standing on a rise, watching them? He could not be sure, but an unshakable sense of dread seized him. He felt a freezing numbness spread across his chest, as if an icy hand had reached out to claim his heart. Beside him, Hodor shivered, sensing it too. With the undead giant slain, men and women from the living forces rushed to fortify new positions. Some carried torches, others brandished dragonglass spears. A line of free folk archers hammered arrow after arrow into the whites, methodically thinning their ranks. White Walkers still stalked the field, but their progress had slowed. The living were not the disorganized rabble they had once been, and now they fought with a ferocity born of desperation. They had seen Hodor kill not one, but two monstrous foes. First the walker that sought to break him, then the undead giant. This gave them courage to believe that the enemy, for all its terror, was not invincible. As the hours stretched, the fight became a grinding stalemate. Snow fell in thick sheets, half blinding everyone. The sky darkened further, though whether it was nearing night or just the storm's fury was impossible to tell. Bran and Hodor, joined by a small contingent of battered soldiers, pushed toward higher ground in search of a vantage point. They found a small hill, strewn with boulders, that overlooked a portion of the battlefield. From there, Bran hoped to see where the White Walkers' leaders were concentrated. If he could guide the archers or perhaps hazard a minimal warg into nearby ravens, they might direct a coordinated strike. But it was all guesswork amid the swirling chaos. Hodor limped painfully, blood trickling from his thigh wound. He refused any suggestion to stay behind, determined to stand by Bran. His hammer was cracked, edges chipped, but still functional. Each step drew a hiss of pain from him, though he tried to hide it. Bran felt a surge of guilt. This gentle man had sacrificed so much, and still he offered more. "Thank you," Bran whispered, though he knew words were insufficient. Hodor gave a small nod, managing a quiet Hodor, as if to say it was all right. Around them, men stumbled, hacking at wights that ambushed from behind boulders or through drifts. The wind carried a cacophony of screaming, howling, and the constant clang of steel. At last they gained the crest of the hill. From that vantage, they could see pockets of the living forming defensive circles below, torches flickering in the gloom. Here and there, a flicker of bright blue signaled the presence of a White Walker. The lines were fluid. Sometimes the living rallied and pushed forward, only to be driven back by a fresh wave. A feeling of despair tugged at Bran's heart. They had inflicted losses on the enemy, yes, but the White Walkers had an almost limitless supply of corpses to reanimate. Meanwhile, every soldier lost on the living side might rise again as a White. No matter how bravely they fought, it seemed the tide was endless. Could they truly hold out until dawn? And would dawn even matter in this storm? Then, abruptly, a figure scrambled up the hill toward them. Mira Reed, hair plastered to her skull with melting sleet, face smeared with grime, spear in hand. Relief flooded Bran's chest at the sight of her alive. She hurried over, breathing hard. "I've been looking for you everywhere," she gasped, glancing worriedly at Hodor's injuries. "Are you all right?" Bran nodded, though his face was drawn. "We're managing. Hodor's been hurt, but he's still standing." The giant gave a weary nod. "Hodor." Mira pressed her lips together, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank the gods," she whispered. Then her voice hardened. "Bran, we have a chance. Some of the Southern Knights have begun a charge against the White Walkers' flank, drawing them away. If we can strike at their central mass, we might disrupt their line enough to gain the upper hand." Bran frowned. "How?" "Their central mass is mostly Whites, but the White Walkers themselves. That's the point. Some among our archers have kept back a small reserve of dragonglass arrows, waiting for a moment to use them effectively. If we can find a vantage, direct them at the White Walkers who are coordinating the Whites, we might break the Horde's cohesion." She pointed to a rocky outcropping halfway across the battlefield. "We get up there, launch a precise volley, and maybe, just maybe, we scatter them. The Whites will still be dangerous, but less organized." Bran followed her gaze. The outcropping was a stretch of tall rocks that rose in a jagged line. Indeed, it overlooked the center of the enemy formation, where at least 3 White Walkers seemed to be orchestrating the Whites' movements. The plan was risky. Getting there would mean crossing some of the worst of the fighting. And even if they succeeded, the White Walkers might spot them and retaliate. Yet, if they stayed where they were, the battle would likely grind them down eventually. Time was not on the living side. The storm, the endless waves of Whites, the cunning of the White Walkers. Any one of these could seal their fate. Bran looked to Hodor, who still breathed heavily, one hand pressed to his bleeding thigh. Compassion welled up in Bran's chest. "He's hurt, Mira," he said softly, uncertain. "I don't want." But Hodor shook his head, the first emphatic gesture he'd made in hours. Hodor, he said firmly, as if volunteering himself, or telling them he would not be left behind. There was resolve in his eyes, reminiscent of that day he held the door. Mira gently touched his arm. "We can't do it without you," she said. "We'll get you bandaged as best we can. But we need your strength." Within minutes, they had found a strip of cloth to bind Hodor's wound. The bleeding slowed, though he still walked with a limp and a grimace. Together, Bran, Mira, and the small band of men they'd gathered, archers armed with precious dragonglass arrows, began a perilous descent from the hill, weaving through the swirling melee. The men fended off wights whenever they appeared, while Hodor acted as a bulwark whenever the press of undead grew too thick, swinging his hammer to clear a path. Bran kept his eyes peeled for any sudden surge of White Walkers or the haunting presence of the Night King. More than once, he felt the faint tug of that cold awareness, but he pressed on, determined to see this plan through. Progress was slow. Bodies littered the snow, both living and dead. Those too injured to walk had been left to cluster in small pockets, hoping for rescue that might never come. The temperature seemed to drop further with each step. Finally, they neared the rocky outcropping, where jagged columns of stone jutted from the earth like giant fangs. At the base, a knot of wights lurked, moaning and pawing at the ground. Mira led the charge, spear thrusting with lethal precision. Hodor followed, slamming his hammer down in wide arcs. The wights fell away, letting the small group clamber up onto a narrow ledge. From there, a natural pathway led higher, affording a partial view of the battlefield. The archers took up positions behind boulders, stringing their bows, breath steaming in the cold air. Bran peered between two slabs of stone. In the murky gloom, he could make out 3 White Walkers standing amid a cluster of wights, seeming to oversee the entire engagement. Their tall forms were distinctive, each carrying a slender sword of ice. Bran's stomach clenched with anxiety. If they saw this group, a wave of wights would be sent to crush them. They had to act swiftly. Mira nudged one of the archers, pointing to the White Walkers. "Aim carefully," she whispered. "Wait for my word." The archer nodded, cheeks pale but eyes steady. In the hush of the swirling storm, Bran heard the rasp of bowstrings. The archers readied their arrows, each tipped with precious obsidian. A moment later, Mira hissed, "Loose!" 3 arrows streaked through the air. Bran held his breath. One missed entirely, vanishing into the gloom. Another struck a wight that stumbled into the path, destroying it in a burst of brittle bones. The 3rd arrow grazed one of the White Walkers, carving a sliver of ice from its arm but failing to deliver a killing blow. A shriek of rage or pain tore through the wind. The White Walker clutched its arm, turning its blazing eyes toward the outcropping. Wights all around it froze, then pivoted as though receiving direct orders, their ranks shifting to converge on the rocky ledge. Mira grimaced. "Quick, again!" Another volley flew. This time, 2 arrows found their targets. One embedded itself in a walker's chest, shattering it in a spray of ice. The second landed in a wight that was stepping in front, tearing it apart. Yet the remaining 2 White Walkers gestured sharply and the swarm of wights began pouring in the direction of the outcropping, a horrific tide of clacking teeth and rotten limbs. The archers released arrows as fast as they could, but the numbers were staggering. Bran's breath caught as he saw the nearest White Walker, unscathed, begin stalking toward them with lethal grace. The plan had partially succeeded, but now they were pinned. The wights advanced relentlessly, clambering over rocks, some slipping and tumbling, but more just kept coming. Mira stabbed at any that drew too close, while Hodor readied himself, ignoring the pain that throbbed in his leg. The archers, forced to turn from the White Walkers to the immediate threat, fired at the front ranks of the wights. Bran realized with grim clarity that they were outmatched. Even if they managed to hold off the swarm, the White Walker would reach them soon and they had limited arrows left. He could almost taste the bitterness of doom. But he remembered how Hodor had refused to yield, how they had fought so hard to come this far. Surrender was not an option. "Mira," Bran called above the din, "give me cover." He wasn't entirely sure what he planned to do, but the moment demanded action. Mira stabbed a wight in the face, then glanced over her shoulder, eyes wide. Bran took a deep breath, glancing at Hodor. "I have to try." He wasn't certain if he meant warging into ravens or something else, but the time for hesitation was past. Hodor, battered and breathing hard, gave a weary nod. Hodor, he said, as if to assure Bran he'd keep him safe. Bran closed his eyes and reached out with his mind, searching for a nearby animal, anything that might give him vantage or allow him to strike. In the swirling darkness of his mental plane, he sensed them, a flock of ravens perched in a craggy patch of trees behind the rocks, unsettled by the violence. He tentatively extended his consciousness, merging with one of the birds. Instantly, his senses shifted, his body left behind under Hodor's watchful guard, and he soared upward in the raven's form, cutting through the freezing air with powerful beats of wings. From this vantage, the battlefield spread out like a tapestry of horror, lines of men and wights locked in lethal struggle, columns of swirling snow, the faint glow of torches flickering in the gloom. He spotted the two remaining White Walkers. One was directing the whites toward the outcropping, the other further back, possibly directing a different flank. With a swift dip of the raven's wings, Bran swooped down behind the White Walker that was commanding the assault on the outcropping. He knew he couldn't kill it directly in this form, but perhaps he could distract it, lead it astray, or cause enough confusion to give Meera and the archers a moment's advantage. He alighted on a rocky crag near the walker, calling loudly. The walker turned its head, more annoyed than alarmed, but the action was enough to break its concentration. The whites momentarily slowed, uncertain. Sensing the opening, Meera and the archers fired another volley. One arrow soared with unerring aim, heading straight for the White Walker. Bran, in the raven's eyes, saw it coming. The walker turned at the last instant, raising its sword of ice to deflect the projectile. The dragonglass arrow shattered on contact, peppering the walker's face with shards. It reeled, howling in silent fury, crystals embedded in its cheek. A wave of swirling frost erupted around it, and Bran's raven was thrown off balance. He fought to keep aloft, but a crackle of ice ran through the air, and one of the shards struck the raven's wing, crippling it. Bran felt a bolt of pain, then the world spun. The raven plummeted, and the mind link snapped. He was hurled back into his own body, gasping. He opened his eyes to see Hodor crouched over him, fending off a white with a desperate swing of his hammer. The white's skull caved in, and the creature sank, still snapping its jaws until Meera finished it with a spear thrust. Bran shook off the lingering pain of the broken wing, wincing as if his own arm had been struck. "I tried," he murmured, voice thick. "I couldn't." "Shoo," Meera hissed, wiping sweat from her brow. "You bought us a moment. That's enough." Indeed, more archers had seized the opportunity to pepper the walker with dragonglass arrows. None landed a killing blow, but the creature had pulled back a short distance, cloak of ice swirling around it, as if gathering power for a decisive strike. The whites continued to converge, undeterred. Hodor let out a low moan. Hodor, gesturing at the swarm of undead inching closer. The archers were running out of arrows, some rummaging in packs for anything left that had an obsidian tip. Others resorted to their daggers. Their line was forced back into a cramped formation against the rocky ledge, with nowhere to go but down into the throng. Another minute, 2 at most, and the whites would be upon them in a suffocating mass. Bran's heart hammered. All around them, the dead advanced, moaning and screeching. He risked another quick look over the rocks. The flank of men that had attempted a cavalry charge was now bogged down in piles of corpses. The storm raged overhead, thunder rumbling with a sound like collapsing glaciers. To the east, he glimpsed a swirl of ice that might be the Night King's personal guard. Dread nearly strangled him. "We can't stay here," he rasped. "We'll be overrun." Meera's face was set in grim lines. "Then we fight our way out or die trying." She brandished her spear. A white launched itself at her from atop a boulder, and she skewered it mid-lunge, panting. Hodor, trembling from exhaustion and blood loss, swung his hammer at another that tried to flank them. The air was a cacophony of clacking jaws and shrill shrieks. The White Walker in the distance lifted its sword again, pointing it toward the outcropping, and the whites hissed in unison, surging for a final assault. Suddenly, a horn blast from the west rent the air, a deep, resonant note that startled whites and living alike. Another horn answered from the south, then a third from the north. Confusion rippled through the battlefield. Men turned, uncertain whether to expect reinforcements or a new threat. Even the White Walker paused, eye-sword half-lowered. Then, emerging from the swirling snow, banners appeared, dark shapes on horseback, forging across the plain, barreling into the flank of the undead with a thunderous charge. Fresh war cries echoed, the sigil of the wolf, the bear, and the mermen of House Manderley, among others. Reinforcements had come. Across the battlefield, the effect was immediate. The whites found themselves attacked from multiple angles. The cavalry charge slammed into them with terrifying momentum, hoofs crushing bone, swords flashing. Disorganized, the dead reeled, losing their tight formation. A wave of relief spread through the living as they realized that these were allied houses who had finally joined the fight, perhaps drawn by ravens or by a belated sense of duty. For once, men outnumbered the whites in a localized spot, turning the tide. Even the White Walker directing the swarm near the outcropping seemed momentarily disoriented, as if struggling to reassert control over its scattered minions. Seizing this sudden advantage, Bran shouted to the archers, "Now!" They unleashed what remained of their dragoglass arrows. One sword true, striking the White Walker in the ribs. A crystalline shriek split the air. The walker's form cracked, splintering into icy shards that dissolved almost instantly. A collective roar of triumph rose among the small group. Without their leader's direct command, the whites in that segment of the field shambled in confused circles, easier targets for the cavalry to dispatch. Hodor sagged in relief, letting out a ragged breath. He dropped his hammer to clutch his wound. Thigh blood soaking the makeshift bandage. He was on the verge of collapse. Bran and Mira moved to support him, wrapping an arm around his broad waist, half carrying him. The archers and the few foot soldiers with them picked off the last whites in the immediate area. For the moment, the outcropping was relatively secure. Below, the newly arrived forces carved a path through the undead, though the battle was far from won. The swirling storm continued, the snow thick as ever, and the Night King's presence lurked somewhere on the periphery, no doubt calculating its next move. Bran looked to Mira. "We have to get Hodor to safety," he said firmly. "He's losing too much blood." She nodded, grim-faced. There was no argument. They were no use if they let the giant bleed out. So, with the help of 2 soldiers, they navigated a treacherous path back down the rocks, steering clear of any large clusters of whites. The cavalry's arrival had at least broken the immediate siege on that flank, giving them a chance to reach a triage area that had been hastily set up behind makeshift walls of snow and rubble. The scene in the triage area was grim. Wounded men lay on the ground, moaning in pain, some missing limbs or covered in frostbite. A few women hurried about with whatever supplies could be found, clean rags, meager poultices, heated water. There were no real maesters, only individuals with rudimentary field medicine skills. Bran felt bile rise in his throat as he saw the carnage. But he pushed on, helping Mira guide Hodor to a space near a dying campfire where a middle-aged woman knelt with bandages. She blinked at Hodor's sheer size, her eyes widening. "Lay him here," she said. "I'll do what I can." Carefully, they lowered him onto a bed of ragged furs, and Hodor let out a groan, closing his eyes. Bran knelt by Hodor's side, heartbeat thudding. "You'll be all right," he said, though tears pricked at his eyelids. Hodor shivered, lips parted in a soundless plea. Bran held the giant's hand, or rather, pressed his palm against 2 of the man's enormous fingers. "Hodor?" Hodor managed, as if asking for reassurance. "Yes," Bran whispered, forcing confidence into his tone. "We're safe for now. You did so well. Rest." The woman began to unwrap the blood-soaked bandage from Hodor's thigh. She grimaced at the deep, jagged wound. "Needs stitching." "We'll stop the bleeding first," she said, rummaging through a pouch. Another person heated a thin needle in the fire. Bran forced himself to look away, feeling useless. Mira placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, then quietly excused herself. "I'll go see what else I can do," she said, likely meaning she would scout and see how the battle fared. Bran nodded, suddenly feeling a hollow ache. He hated doing nothing, hated feeling so helpless when the realm hung in the balance. Yet he understood that if he tried to warg again recklessly, he might compromise them all. Already, the brush with the White Walker's mental presence had nearly destroyed him once. He needed to wait for the right moment, or at least until the immediate crisis of Hodor's bleeding was resolved. So he remained at Hodor's side, holding the giant's hand, murmuring soft reassurances. The triage area bustled with moans, hushed conversations, the crackle of small fires. Snow drifted in through every gap. The sky overhead churned with dark clouds, as though day and night had fused into one endless twilight. In the distance, the clang and clamor of battle continued, but for the wounded, the war was more immediate, the fight against death one breath at a time. As the minutes ticked by, Hodor slipped in and out of consciousness, wincing at the needle's sting as the woman stitched the gash. She worked as quickly as she could, hands nimble despite the cold. Finally, she tied off the thread and pressed a poultice to the wound, binding it with fresh cloth. "That's the best I can do," she murmured to Bran, looking weary. "He shouldn't be moved much. Keep him warm, keep an eye on him. If the bleeding doesn't start again, he might pull through." Bran thanked her, voice thick with relief. He remained kneeling, ignoring the numbness in his legs, brushing snow from Hodor's brow whenever it accumulated. The big man lay breathing shallowly, a sheen of sweat on his face despite the cold. Every so often he'd murmur, "Hodor," as though the word itself was a lifeline. Bran's thoughts swirled with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. Gratitude that Hodor was still alive, guilt that he had once again been forced into mortal danger to protect Bran. How many times would Hodor have to sacrifice himself? Time was a blur. An hour, maybe two, passed. The tide of battle changed forms again, sometimes sounding closer, sometimes more distant. Desperate shouts came and went. The triage area filled further with wounded. Some died quietly, others screamed as their injuries proved too grave. Bran wondered if the living were on the verge of total collapse or if the reinforcements had tipped the balance. A young boy stumbled in, blood on his tunic, eyes wide. He collapsed near the fire and the medic rushed to him, shaking her head. Everywhere was tragedy. Eventually, Mira returned, face drawn. "It's stalemate out there," she said softly, kneeling beside Bran. "The cavalry is making progress, but the storm grows worse. Some White Walkers remain, not to mention the Whites. The Night King hasn't shown himself fully, if he's even here. Nobody knows. We can't see more than a few yards in any direction." Her eyes shifted to Hodor's still form. "How is he?" Bran gestured to the bandaged wound. "It's bad, but they stitched him. He's stable for now." Mira nodded, relief flickering in her tired gaze. She placed a hand on Hodor's shoulder, gently. "You rest, big friend," she whispered. "We still need you." Hodor made a faint sound of acknowledgement, eyes half-lidded. They could do little more than wait. Bran alternated between scanning the swirling gloom with his limited sight and shutting his eyes against the horror. Mira moved among the wounded, offering what help she could. After a time, a small group of battered soldiers arrived, exclaiming that they had cleared one side of the battlefield, but fresh Whites appeared from the far north. The storm raged, and the living were spread thin. The best guess was that the war would stretch until the White Walkers either mustered one final push or retreated, regrouping for another day. Everyone dreaded the first scenario, for it might mean total annihilation. Yet, if the second occurred, it merely postponed the inevitable. So close to victory, so near defeat, the line was razor-thin. Night fell, or perhaps the darkness deepened further. It was impossible to tell. Small fires dotted the battlefield like wounded stars, while the wind keened overhead. Eventually, Mira convinced Bran to sleep for a brief spell, promising to watch over Hodor. Despite the turmoil, exhaustion overcame him. He dozed fitfully, haunted by disjointed dreams of ravens, locked doors, and swirling ice. When he awoke, stiff and cold, the triage area was quieter. Some of the wounded had died. Others had improved enough to be moved. Hodor remained unconscious, though his breathing seemed less labored. Bran stretched, his back aching, and looked around. The medic was dozing by the embers of a dying fire. Mira was gone. Panic tightened his chest. He rose carefully, wincing at the numbness in his legs, and scanned the darkness. In the faint light, he spotted Mira's spear near the entrance to the makeshift barrier that enclosed the triage. Gathering his courage, he limped that way, peering outside. The scene that greeted him was bleak. Bodies, shattered weapons, pools of blackened ice. Yet the roar of battle had diminished. Clusters of men were scavenging for the wounded, or finishing off crippled Whites that still squirmed. A handful of White Walker corpses glittered among the carnage, reduced to shards of ice that occasionally glistened in torchlight. Could it be that the living had driven them away? The notion seemed too good to believe, yet the battlefield was far quieter than before. Catching sight of Mira near a group of soldiers, Bran hurried over. She noticed him, relief flooding her expression. "You're awake," she said. "I didn't want to disturb you. You needed rest. Seems we might have one. Or at least the White Walkers have withdrawn. Their Whites have mostly scattered or been destroyed." Bran gaped, scanning the devastated plain. The aura of dread still lingered, but no new waves of undead marched. Everywhere, men moved about collecting their dead, faces hollow with grief and exhaustion. Then, the Night King has left? Bran asked, hardly daring to voice the question. Mira shrugged. No one knows. Some say they saw a figure vanish into the storm, and then the whites began to collapse. Others claim the Night King was never here in person. In any case, the White Walkers who led this assault are gone, shattered or fled. The living hold the field. A mixture of relief and lingering dread washed over Bran. This was a reprieve, but not necessarily the end of the war. Still, they had survived one of the largest battles against the dead, and that was no small thing. We must see to Hodor, he murmured. As soon as he can move, we should find a more secure place. Mira nodded, understanding. Though the White Walkers had retreated, they might return without warning. Already, talk spread of re-establishing stronger fortifications further south and forging new alliances. The realm was battered, but not broken. Returning to Hodor's side, Bran found the giant awake, blinking groggily. The stitches in his thigh looked swollen, but not bleeding. He managed to croak a faint Hodor, as Bran knelt beside him. Yes, Bran said gently, a weary smile forming. We're alive. You did it again. You saved us all. The giant's gaze flicked with uncertainty, as if he didn't quite remember everything. But recognition softened his features, and he reached out to pat Bran's shoulder with surprising tenderness. Bran leaned in, resting his forehead against Hodor's. In that silent moment, a wave of gratitude and love passed between them. No words were needed to convey it. Over the next days, the survivors took stock of their situation. The lords and commanders who had come to their aid conferred with the remnants of the original camp. Some tents were salvaged, a few supply wagons were found, and the wounded were organized in a larger triage center. Funerals were impossible in the frozen ground, so the dead were piled and burned to prevent them from rising again. The smell of charred flesh tainted the air. It was a grim, sobering task, and many who undertook it wept openly. Hodor, though stable, could barely walk at first. Bran and Mira fashioned a sled with rope, upon which Hodor could rest while they pulled him short distances. He bore the indignity with stoic acceptance, his eyes often drifting to the horizon where the storm clouds still churned. Word arrived that smaller battles had broken out across the north, with varying outcomes. The White Walkers were far from defeated, but their massive assault here had been thwarted. Some said the Night King had turned his eye elsewhere, perhaps searching for a weakness. Others believed the White Walkers needed time to replenish their numbers, given how many they had lost. In either case, the living seized the chance to regroup. This new alliance, an amalgam of northern houses, free folk, knights from the Vale, and more, strove to fortify a central location, a place with both natural and man-made defenses. After some debate, they agreed to move southward to the remnants of an old fortress set near a mountain pass. Though battered by centuries of neglect, the fortress walls still stood and it lay near a major road where further reinforcements could arrive. So the battered remnants of the army marched again, heads bowed against the cold. Hodor sat on his sled, legs stretched out awkwardly. Mira and Bran took turns guiding the rope along with any volunteers who offered help. No one complained about the burden. Hodor had earned a hero's place in the hearts of many. Soldiers who once looked at him with pity or confusion now regarded him with quiet respect, sometimes offering a salute or a kind word. The giant responded with a timid smile and his gentle refrain, Hodor, which seemed to convey all that needed to be said. The journey to the fortress took several days, crawling through snowdrifts, across frozen rivers, and around half-buried ruins of villages. The extent of the devastation was sobering. Occasionally, they found entire hamlets reduced to skeletal frames burned in hasty attempts to prevent the dead from rising. They encountered refugees who fell in behind their column, grateful for any semblance of protection. The nights were brutally cold and the storms sporadically attacked them, forcing everyone to huddle around meager fires. Hodor improved day by day, the stitches in his thigh healing enough that he could hobble on crutches if needed. But the scar on his shoulder and the deeper aches in his bones did not fade so quickly. At last, they reached the fortress, a stone stronghold set against a rocky hill with a curtain wall in dire need of repair. Teams of able-bodied workers set about patching it. Sentries were posted on the crumbling towers. Inside, in a large courtyard, a sense of fragile hope bloomed. Fires burned in braziers and men hammered the walls with fresh timbers. The Allied forces claimed different corners of the fortress for their banners, but there was no talk of feuds now. All recognized that unity was their only chance. Winter deepened further, as if the season itself waged war on the living. Though the White Walkers did not launch another massive assault right away, smaller raids were reported in the outlying areas. Bran busied himself with council meetings, sharing whatever visions or knowledge he could glean without delving too deep into the dangerous realm of the Night King's awareness. Mira joined scouting parties, using her experience from traveling beyond the wall to guide them. Hodor was often left in the fortress, helping with manual tasks where his strength proved invaluable, hauling timbers, stacking sacks of grain, comforting frightened children. Watching him with the children was particularly touching. They would approach him, eyes wide, hearing stories of his bravery, and he would smile gently, letting them scramble around his legs, repeating "Hodor" in playful tones. It reminded Bran of simpler days, before the enormity of winter's terror weighed so heavily on them all. Weeks passed. The fortress transformed into a fledgling settlement. Smiths set up forges, the clang of metal echoing off stone walls. Food remained scarce, but supply lines began trickling in from more southerly regions. People arrived, fleeing the destruction further north. Among the new arrivals were healers with rudimentary knowledge of herbs, giving the wounded a better chance of survival. Sometimes those wounded included Hodor, though by now his thigh had mostly mended and he could walk with only a slight limp, aided by a staff. The big man's presence became a fixture in the courtyard, where he would help unload carts, distribute rations, or simply offer a reassuring smile. One cold morning, a council was called in the Great Hall, which had been hastily refurbished to host meetings. Lords from the north, Knights of the Vale, free folk chieftains, and other representatives gathered around a massive table. Bran, seated near the head, looked small and young among the grizzled warriors and titled nobles. Mira stood behind him, arms crossed. Hodor waited by the door, leaning on his staff. He preferred to remain close, even if he seldom understood the intricacies of their debates. The topic of the council was straightforward yet heavy: how to defeat the Night King once and for all. The conversation ranged from employing dragons, if any still lived or could be found, to forging steel with obsidian, to appealing to rumored magical relics or secret rites. Most plans sounded desperate. The reality was grim: the Night King would return, and if they failed to meet him on a more advantageous footing, the entire realm would fall into darkness. Amid the debates, a free folk elder named Bract rose to speak. He recounted ancient legends told by the elders beyond the wall, how once before, in the long night, the children of the forest and the first men worked together to repel the darkness, forging an alliance at the heart of the weirwood groves. According to these tales, the primal magic of the weirwood roots could repel the White Walkers if harnessed properly. Bran listened intently, the hair on the back of his neck rising, for some of this knowledge echoed the teachings of the three-eyed raven. Yet the elder's voice trembled with uncertainty. Could they replicate such a feat now, when the children were all but gone? Perhaps we must try, Bract concluded, voice low. Or else the Night King will keep coming. There was a somber murmur around the table. The man who acted as steward in the fortress cleared his throat. Even if it works, how do we gather that magic? The weirwood groves are far away and heavily blanketed by snow. The White Walkers often lurk near them. Another lord spat. Chasing old tales and forest spells won't feed our people nor build our walls. We need a real strategy, one of steel and soldiers. This sparked an argument, voices rising. Bran, drawn by an inner certainty, found himself speaking up. I've seen what they did to Hodor, he said softly, the room quieting as they turned to him. They exploit any weakness, physical, mental, magical. If we rely on steel alone, we're fighting them on their terms. They can always raise more whites. But if we find a way to disrupt their power at its source, then maybe we stand a chance. His gaze swept the assembly. I can't say for certain the weirwood magic is the key, but it's something. We have to explore every avenue. These are not foes bound by mortal rules. His words lingered, and the council eventually decided to send scouting parties north again, searching for the fabled weirwood sites that might hold a remnant of ancient wards. The plan was fragile and uncertain, but in the face of annihilation, every possibility had to be considered. Mira volunteered to lead one such expedition, and when Hodor heard, he immediately murmured Hodor, pointing to himself. He would not be left behind. Though Bran worried about Hodor's injuries, he also knew that if ancient magic was found, Hodor's presence, having once been touched by the weirwood network through Bran's warging, could be significant. The giant was living proof that the old powers could still run deep even in a man who spoke one word. Preparations for the expedition were hurried. Winter did not yield its grip, and each day brought more tales of scattered raids by whites. Nonetheless, a small band of volunteers, rangers, free folk hunters, a handful of knights, Mira and Hodor assembled at the fortress gates one chilly dawn. Bran stood in the courtyard to see them off, face sober. He had decided to stay behind to help coordinate defenses and watch for any signs of the Night King's return. "Are you sure you won't come?" Mira asked, adjusting the straps of her gear. Bran shook his head. "My place is here," he said. "I can't risk opening myself too much until we know more. Just be careful." She nodded and embraced him briefly. Then she turned to Hodor, who leaned on his staff, gazing down at Bran with worried eyes. "Hodor," he said softly, as if to say goodbye or ask for comfort. Bran reached up, took the giant's hand. "You'll be all right," he whispered, voice thick. "You've faced worse. Just remember, if you feel them trying to get in your head, hold the door. Don't let them in." Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes. Hodor nodded, lip quivering. Then he let out a determined breath and followed Mira toward the exit. The gates swung open with a groan, and the expedition departed into the pale dawn. Snow whipped at their cloaks, obscuring them from view soon after they left. Bran stood there for a long while, ignoring the biting cold, until the last shape vanished into the distance. Then he turned back, heart heavy, praying silently that Hodor's ordeal would not repeat itself in some new horror. He had to trust Mira and their companions to protect him, just as they trusted Hodor's strength to protect them. What followed was a restless waiting period for those who remained in the fortress. Routine tasks filled the days. Distributing rations, reinforcing defenses, hosting smaller lords who trickled in with their few remaining men, forging alliances born of necessity. Always, the fear of another White Walker onslaught loomed. Bran conferred with the lords, carefully using his visions to scout the edges of the north, mindful not to let the Night King sense him. Some nights, he dreamt of that black ice labyrinth, of Hodor's echoing cry, and woke drenched in sweat. He would stare at the walls, wishing dawn would come faster. The expedition faced peril almost from the outset. High snowdrifts and roving whites forced them to take detours, slowing progress. Mira led them along half-frozen rivers and through dense pine forests. They skirted old villages that had been overrun, seeing fresh footprints in the snow that suggested the undead might be near. At times, they spied White Walkers in the distance, or glimpsed them through trees, but avoided open conflict. Their goal was to reach a rumored grove of ancient weirwoods, one that locals said was untouched for centuries, hidden in a rocky valley. None could confirm if the grove truly held any power, but the Free Folk Scouts insisted the place had an eerie reputation, that even the White Walkers gave it a wide berth in the old days. Hodor trudged along with the group, staff in hand, sometimes leaning on Mira when his old wound flared. The nights were the worst. They camped in partial ruins or under thickets, lighting small fires if they dared. Sleep was elusive. Hodor often stirred from nightmares, moaning Hodor in a broken whisper, tears leaking down his face. Mira would soothe him, telling him it was all right, that he was safe. He nodded, though the fear lingered in his eyes. The memory of nearly being possessed never left him. It clung to him like a shadow. On the 5th day, they found themselves at the base of a steep ravine. The Free Folk guide insisted this was the final approach. Above them, gnarled trees poked out of the rock, their trunks twisted by centuries of wind. Snow fell in clumps and icicles hung from every branch. "We're close," the guide said. "The weirwoods are just beyond that ridge." So they pressed on, half climbing, half slipping, occasionally using ropes to haul themselves higher. Hodor's strength proved invaluable not just for carrying supplies but for steadying less agile climbers. The big man said little, just plodded along, eyes set on the path. At dusk, they crested the ridge. What lay beyond made them catch their breath. A hidden valley stretched out below, blanketed in snow. Yet amid the white expanse stood a ring of towering weirwoods, their bark pale as bone, branches drooping with crimson leaves that somehow still clung to life despite the bitter cold. The setting sun cast an otherworldly glow on the trees, staining the snow pinkish red. A hush fell over the company. The free folk guide exhaled sharply, muttering, "It's real. Gods be good, it's real." They descended carefully, hearts pounding with anticipation. As they neared the grove, an unsettling sensation prickled their skin like a silent hum in the air. For Hodor, it felt strangely familiar. He recalled the cave of the three-eyed raven, the tang of ancient magic that suffused everything there. The weirwood's carved faces, old, weathered visages, seemed to watch them approach. Mira paused, scanning the perimeter for threats, but saw no wights, no signs of White Walkers. The place was eerily calm, as if wrapped in a bubble of timelessness. They made camp just outside the ring of trees, deciding to wait until morning to explore more thoroughly. Mira posted sentries, though the forest felt oddly tranquil, as if no living or undead creature dared intrude. Hodor gazed at the weirwoods, brow furrowing. Something tugged at his memory, Bran's presence, the old stories of the children. He felt a shiver, not of fear but of awe. That night, he dreamed he was standing beneath a colossal weirwood, its branches reaching the sky, and a voice whispered to him, though he could not understand the words. He woke feeling both unsettled and profoundly moved. At first light, Mira and a small group ventured into the grove's heart. Hodor followed, staff tapping on the frozen ground. Snow lay thick around the tree roots, but the red leaves seemed immune to winter's bite. The faces carved into the trunks stared with empty eyes, some ringed by faint red stains where the sap had bled. The air seemed to thrum. A primal hush enveloped them. Mira spoke softly, "If there is magic here, how do we harness it?" No one had an immediate answer. They spread out, searching for any clue, a hidden cave, a pattern in the roots, a reflection in the icy pond at the grove center. Hodor wandered among the trunks, brushing his large hand against the bark. It felt warm, or at least not as cold as expected. He paused by one face that was worn away to little more than a suggestion of eyes and a mouth. Somewhere deep inside him, he sensed a faint stirring, like the echo of a voice calling across centuries. It was a feeling he had known once, the day he and Bran found the three-eyed raven. Something about the weirwood network, the labyrinth of roots beneath the earth, connected all such trees, bridging time and memory. He remembered how Bran had touched his mind, how the White Walkers had tried to invade it. Now, as he stood here, he felt none of that icy malice, only a patient, ancient watchfulness. A single word escaped his lips, "Hodor," but it sounded like a question to the weirwood itself, as if he were asking for guidance. At that moment, a gust of wind rippled the red leaves. Snow tumbled from the branches, and a faint rustling filled the grove. Mira, across the clearing, snapped her gaze to Hodor. "Are you all right?" she called, stepping closer. He turned to her, eyes wide, then back to the weirwood face. A trickle of red sap ran from the corner of the carved mouth, dripping onto the snow like crimson tears. Hodor's heart pounded. He hesitantly pressed a palm to the trunk. A mild tingling warmth crept up his arm, making him gasp. Then, unbidden, an image filled his mind, Bran as a young boy, sitting by a pond at Winterfell, gazing into the water. A raven perched on a nearby branch. The image shifted. Hodor saw glimpses of that fateful day when he held the door, the whites clawing, Bran shouting. Another shift, he saw a swirl of green light, the ancient children of the forest chanting softly, weaving spells around a weirwood heart tree. Finally, the image settled on the present, the hidden grove, red leaves overhead, and Hodor himself standing beneath the face in the bark. He drew a sharp breath, blinking tears from his eyes. He did not fully understand the message, but it felt as though the weirwood was showing him a tapestry of time, reminding him of his link to Bran and the old magic. His hand trembled on the trunk. If only he could speak, tell Mira or the others what he saw. But all he managed was a choked Hodor. A tear slipped down his cheek. Mira, seeing his emotion, gently placed a hand on his arm. "It's all right," she murmured, unsure of his vision but sensing the significance. "We're here with you." The rest of the day, they explored the grove in cautious reverence. Some of the free folk admitted they felt a subtle sense of safety here. No whites approached. Even the wind outside the grove seemed to hush at the perimeter. By evening, they decided to remain another night, gathering in a circle beneath the largest weirwood. They built a small fire, staving off the chill, though they were careful not to burn any fallen branches from the sacred trees. The conversation inevitably turned to how they might use this place against the White Walkers. "Could we lure them here?" one hunter asked. "If the old magic is strong enough to repel them, might they be destroyed if they tried to enter?" Another argued it was too dangerous to bring the dead here. The discussion ran in circles. Hodor listened, silent except for the occasional murmur of his name. He felt a stirring in his mind. Something in the weirwood network called to him. Though he lacked the words to articulate it, he sensed that if Bran were here, the boy might harness the power directly. Hodor could not do that. Yet, perhaps he could serve as a conduit as he had once done for Bran without fully realizing it. A pang of longing coursed through him, an ache to be reunited with the friend who shared his spirit. But Bran was back at the fortress. Next morning, Mira gathered the group. "We've seen no sign of the enemy. We should head back and report what we found. Perhaps Bran can glean more from these visions if he comes here himself." Everyone agreed, though a few hunters suggested staying behind to guard the grove, just in case. After some debate, it was decided they would split. One contingent would remain, building rudimentary defenses outside the sacred ring. The rest, including Mira and Hodor, would return to the fortress with news. Hodor felt relief at the thought of seeing Bran again, of telling him somehow what the weirwood had revealed. The journey back was not as smooth. As they retraced their path through ravines and forests, they encountered fresh white tracks, suggesting the enemy was not entirely absent. More than once, they were forced to hide until small patrols of undead moved on. Nonetheless, they managed to avoid direct confrontation. Mira marveled aloud that perhaps the White Walkers had been distracted or weakened by the previous battle. Hodor, remembering that final image of the weirwood, suspected there was something else at play, some intangible magic that shielded them. Either way, they pressed on, determined to reach the fortress and share their discoveries. Meanwhile, back at the fortress, Bran wrestled with restlessness. He longed for word from Mira and Hodor. Some nights, he ventured briefly into the weirwood dreams, carefully so as not to draw the Night King's gaze. He glimpsed flickers of a hidden grove, red leaves swaying, but the image slipped away whenever he tried to focus. It felt like the grove itself was teasing him, beckoning him north. He dreaded the possibility that the expedition had met some disaster. Still, no new wave of White Walkers threatened the fortress, though rumors persisted of their presence in the far north. Each day was an exercise in anxious patience. At last, one afternoon, the sentries atop the walls shouted that a band of travelers was approaching. Bran hurried out to the courtyard, heart in his throat. The gates opened, revealing Mira, her face windburned but triumphant, and behind her, Hodor, leaning on his staff, face lighting up at the sight of Bran. Others followed, bearing tired smiles. Bran rushed forward, ignoring the formalities, and embraced Mira. Then he turned to Hodor. The big man dropped his staff to enfold Bran in a careful hug. Bran felt tears burn his eyes. He patted Hodor's arm, whispering, "I missed you." Hodor's voice came out thick. "Hodor?" That one word carried volumes of relief, longing, and love. Later, in the great hall, Mira recounted everything they had found. She described the secret grove, the feeling of ancient magic, how no whites ventured within. The free folk agreed with her testimony, adding that the old stories spoke of such places as bastions of warding power. Bran listened, enthralled, heart-pounding. "I felt glimpses of it in my dreams," he said softly. "Maybe I can amplify its effect. If that grove truly repels the walkers, it could be the key to turning the tide." Discussion erupted among the fortress leadership. Some wanted to remain behind these walls, not risking a relocation to a remote grove. Others argued that if the White Walkers attacked again, they might eventually breach the fortress, no matter how strong the defenses. The grove, if it indeed held wards against the undead, might offer a permanent solution. The debate was fierce, but eventually it was decided that a portion of their forces would journey north, fortifying near the grove, while others stayed to defend the fortress. It was a gamble, but with winter's vice tightening, gambles had become necessary. Hodor, for his part, understood only that they were heading back to the place that had spoken to him through the weirwood trunk. He felt an odd mixture of apprehension and excitement. Part of him feared encountering the White Walkers again, especially if the plan was to lure them into a confrontation on sacred ground. Another part sensed that this was his destiny. He had been shaped by old magic, marked by the White Walkers' attempt to claim him, and survived. Perhaps he had a role to play in bridging these powers, just as he had once bridged the mind of Bran with his own. In the weeks that followed, preparations began. Carts were loaded with supplies, building materials, food. A second wave of volunteers assembled, knights, free folk, even a few southern lords who recognized that cowering behind walls would not save them from the endless night. Smiths labored day and night to forge more dragaglass weapons. Bran honed his abilities in small increments, gleaning what he could from the local weirwoods. He felt a quiet hum in his dreams, as though the entire network of ancient trees was awakening in response to the looming threat. Hodor stayed close by, sometimes helping move supplies, sometimes sitting quietly while Bran practiced. He still struggled with nightmares, but in the grove's memory he also found a semblance of hope. Finally, the expedition was ready. Larger this time, it included families willing to risk everything on the chance that the Weirwood Circle could protect them. The fortress would remain occupied by a garrison in case the White Walkers threatened from another direction. Bran led the column, riding in a modified sled drawn by 2 sturdy horses. Mira rode at the head with the scouts. Hodor walked alongside Bran's sled, staff in one hand, a new dragonglass-tipped hammer slung across his back, courtesy of the fortress smiths who revered his previous deeds. His thigh still twinged, but he stood straighter now, buoyed by the sense of purpose in the air. The march north was arduous. They faced storms, whites prowling at the edges of the column, and frost-cracked roads. But their numbers and discipline helped them push through. Each evening they camped in fortified positions, rotating watch. Hodor patrolled sometimes, gripping his hammer, scanning the dark for any sign of that bone-chilling presence. The nights were long, and people whispered fearful prayers, but the expedition pressed on, determined to reach the magical grove before the next full-blown assault from the undead. When at last they sighted the ring of weirwoods, the relief was palpable. The place stood as serene and timeless as before. Even the free folk who had remained behind to guard it waved greetings, reporting minimal trouble from whites. Only a few scattered patrols had shown up, which were easily driven off. It seemed that some intangible boundary kept the undead from swarming the grove en masse. Now, with a larger force, they hoped to expand that boundary, build a settlement, and entice the White Walkers into a final confrontation on grounds that favored the living. The plan was fraught with peril. But in these times, hope and peril walked hand in hand. Within days, the group set to work around the grove. They built a palisade of sharpened stakes, erected tents, and laid down rough walkways so people could move about without sinking in snow. Scouts patrolled the perimeter, watchful. Inside the circle of trees, Bran spent long hours meditating, placing his hand on the weirwood faces and drifting into half-dream states. Hodor sat nearby, ready to catch him if he collapsed, remembering all too well how vulnerable Bran became in such trances. More than once, as Bran drifted, Hodor felt a mild stirring of energy, as though the weirwood's essence brushed against them both. It was neither painful nor frightening, but it made his heart race, for it reminded him that he was not just a bystander in this cosmic struggle. Finally, after a fortnight of preparation, a hush fell over the new settlement. The watchers on the northern ridges had spotted movement, vast shapes in the distance, marching. Everyone knew what it meant. The White Walkers were coming. War horns sounded, echoing through the frosty air. People scrambled to their posts. Fires were lit in braziers, and archers stationed themselves behind barricades. The sky above was a dull gray, no sign of sunshine. A dreadful tension gripped every heart, for this was not just a skirmish. It felt like the final test of the weirwood's rumored power. Bran, pale but resolute, wheeled himself, with Hodor's help, to the largest tree in the center of the ring. Mira and a few chosen allies formed a protective circle around him. Hodor stood beside Bran, hammer in hand, scanning the edge of the grove for the first sign of undead. The rest of the settlement braced for impact, weapons ready, breath pluming in the cold. They didn't have to wait long. Through the swirling snow, the undead emerged in ominous ranks. Dozens, hundreds, perhaps thousands of whites, accompanied by a scattering of White Walkers. Far to the rear, a tall shape with a crown of icy horns loomed. There was no mistaking the aura of malevolence. The Night King was here in person. A collective shiver ran through the living. This would be the greatest challenge they had ever faced. As the undead horde approached, something remarkable happened. Those whites that drew too close to the ring of weirwoods slowed, some even crumpling to the ground as if a great weight pressed on them. Others stopped entirely, their lifeless eyes flickering. It was as though the ancient magic emanating from the grove disrupted their animating force. The White Walkers, however, advanced more cautiously, their presence bolstering some whites enough to keep them moving. The Night King himself stepped forward, tall and silent, raising one pale hand. A wave of freezing power rolled toward the grove, clashing with whatever ward lay across the boundary. Sparks of unseen energy crackled in the air, and many of the living cried out, clutching their heads. Hodor groaned, pressing a hand to his temple. He could feel that prying, invasive will seeking a foothold in his mind once more. Bran inhaled sharply, placing both hands on the weirwood trunk. He closed his eyes. The ring of trees seemed to rustle in sympathy, leaves quivering despite the stillness of the air. Slowly, Bran let himself slip into a trance, merging with the weirwood network. Hodor, battered by the mental onslaught, gritted his teeth. He remembered the horrors of that psychic assault, but also the warmth of the weirwood's presence. A storm raged inside him, the White Walker's cold voice, urging him to yield. The weirwood's silent strength offering refuge. He pressed closer to Bran, arms shaking. "Hodor," he gasped. as if calling on that single word to anchor him. The White Walkers pressed their advantage, advancing carefully around the circle. Whites at their feet surged forward, some succumbing to the ward, others marching on. The living fought back with dragonglass arrows, spears, and swords, cutting down undead that broke through. A savage melee erupted along the perimeter. Within the grove, frost began to creep over the exposed roots, as if the Night King's power sought to corrupt the heart trees. The air was stifling with tension, a claustrophobic kind of cold. Hodor's breath billowed, teeth chattering. He felt a vile whisper in the back of his mind, promising relief if he just opened the door. He clung to Bran's side, refusing to budge. Then Bran's eyes snapped open. They glowed with a strange light, not white or blue but a shimmering greenish hue, like the heart of an old forest at dawn. He spoke, though his voice was layered, echoing with another's timbre. "You shall not have him," he said, and the words reverberated in the air. Hodor felt a burst of warmth flood his chest. The root beneath them glowed faintly, a pulse that spread along the ring of weirwoods. Leaves rustled louder, and the carved faces wept red sap that hissed on the snow. A barrier of shimmering force flickered around the grove's interior, pressing outward, colliding with the cold aura radiating from the Night King. A silent struggle ensued. The sky dimmed, swirling with unnatural clouds. Lightning flashed, revealing the Night King's stoic face. He raised both arms, unleashing a blast of frigid wind. The living on the perimeter cried out, some flung backward. The barrier around the weirwoods rippled, cracks forming in midair, as though the power was stretched to its limit. Bran trembled, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Hodor!" he called faintly, reaching out a hand. In that instant Hodor understood. He clutched Bran's hand, merging his will with Bran's as best he could, letting the wave of warmth from the weirwood envelope him. Memories flared. His life as Wylus, the stable boy, the visions, the tragedy that had shaped him, the unwavering devotion that bound him to Bran. He roared his name, "Hodor!" Not in fear, but in defiance. Through that shared contact, a current of energy surged from Bran into Hodor, and from Hodor into the weirwood trunk. The carved face on the bark seemed to shift, mouth parting slightly. The pulse of magic intensified, swelling into a brilliant wave that exploded outward. All along the perimeter, men and women shielded their eyes. The wave collided with the Night King's power, and for a moment, the entire grove was bathed in an emerald glow. An unearthly howl ripped across the plain, and the tension snapped like an overstretched bowstring. Whites collapsed in droves, their limbs falling slack. The White Walkers recoiled, howling silently, some shattering on the spot as the energy overwhelmed them. The ring of weirwoods glowed, leaves rattling like applause. Only the Night King remained standing at the forefront of his diminished horde, ice crystals swirling around his horned brow. He glared across the space at Bran and Hodor, his eyes burning with an unholy blue rage. Another pulse of green light emanated from the heart of the grove, forcing him backward. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Realizing he could not break this ward now, he retreated, dissolving into a storm of snow that whisked him away into the howling darkness. When the glow subsided, the living forces dared to peek from behind their barricades, breathing heavily. The whites that remained were inert or crumbling, deprived of the animating power that had guided them. The White Walkers, save for a few that had been vaporized, were gone, presumably melted back into the storm with their defeated king. A stunned silence enveloped the grove. Then a cheer began, ragged at first, growing in strength as people realized the gravity of what had happened. They had won, truly won, at least for this night. Perhaps, in banishing the Night King from this sacred place, they had struck a mortal blow. At the center, Hodor still clung to Bran's hand, trembling with exhaustion. Bran slumped, eyes rolling up. Mira rushed forward, catching him before he fell. Hodor sank to his knees, letting out great, heaving breaths. The weave of magic that had bound them was gone now, leaving him both drained and oddly elated. He could still feel a residual warmth from the weirwood behind him, as if it whispered, "You are safe." Over the next hours, the people of the settlement tended to the wounded and tried to piece together what had happened. Men recounted seeing Hodor's form outlined in green light, hand locked with Bran's, driving back the Night King's storm. It became a legend in its own right, told in hushed voices that the simple giant had become the living anchor for the ancient power, that his unwavering heart had fortified the magic of the weirwood. Some believed that the Night King was crippled by this encounter, that he might not rise again with the same strength. Others thought he would regroup. But for now it did not matter. The living had secured a sanctuary in this hidden valley. Bran awoke after a day of deep sleep. He found Mira and Hodor sitting beside him in a makeshift shelter at the grove's edge. Hodor stared at Bran with undisguised relief, tears shining in his eyes. Bran managed a weak smile. "We did it," he murmured. You were there for me. You kept the door shut against him once again." Hodor let out a soft sob, nodding. "Hodor!" They embraced, a tender moment amidst the swirl of celebrations and regrouping around them. In that moment, any doubts about whether Hodor had been destined to serve the White Walkers dissolved. He was no weapon for them, he was a shield for the realm of men, a gentle soul who drew on the oldest powers of the land to save the people he loved. And so the legend of Hodor, the giant who defied the cold and stood as a living bridge to ancient magic, spread far and wide. Travelers who arrived later would speak of the day the White Walkers were turned back by a simple man who could say only one word, yet spoke volumes through his courage. With time, the settlement in the Weirwood Grove grew stronger, and the fortress to the south remained a bastion. The White Walkers, robbed of the element of surprise and faced with the awakened wards of the old gods, retreated deeper into the far north, their threat diminished, though not entirely extinguished. But whether or not they tried again, the living now had a foothold of light in the heart of winter's darkness, and it was Hodor more than any other who had held that light aloft. In the months and years to come, the story would shift into song and myth. People would say that Hodor had a heart as big as the old gods themselves, that he had glimpsed the tapestry of time and chosen a path of love and protection. Children would gather around him in the courtyard, giggling whenever he said, "Hodor." Knights would salute him, and free folk would clap him on the shoulder in gratitude. He remained the same gentle soul, never demanding recognition, content to help where he could, to carry what burdens were asked of him. But all who knew him recognized the deeper truth that in a war of ice and death, Hodor had stood in the breach, a living testament that even fate's darkest design could be shattered by a single act of stubborn, loyal defiance. For all the battles he had fought and all the horrors he had faced, Hodor's spirit never hardened. He kept a soft kindness about him, a readiness to smile, to comfort. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, he would wander among the weirwoods, placing a hand on their trunks. No visions came, not anymore, but a gentle pulse always answered him as if acknowledging a dear friend. He would murmur, "Hodor," quietly, thinking of Bran, of the living he had saved, of the door he had held shut both in body and in mind. In that solitary moment, beneath crimson leaves and pale moonlight, he felt utterly at peace, for he knew his life had mattered. The White Walkers had wanted to turn him into a weapon, but he had chosen another path. And that choice, forged by loyalty, was stronger than any chain of ice could ever be.